Margaret Whitmore didn't cry out when Thomas Callahan slammed the account book down so hard the lamp on the table jumped. She didn't apologize. She didn't lower her eyes the way he expected a woman her size to do when a man raised his voice at her. She just looked at him, steady as stone, and said 6 words that would end his whole understanding of who she was. "The numbers are wrong, Thomas. Not hers. His." Before we go any further, if you love a slow-burn Western romance where the woman everyone underestimates turns out to be the smartest person in the room, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a second of this story. And while you're at it, drop a comment down below and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the morning Margaret Whitmore first set foot on Callahan Creek Ranch, and nobody, not one soul in that yard, had any idea what she was about to become to all of them. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the Callahan Creek gate a little after 10 in the morning, and the first thing the ranch hands did was laugh. Not loud, not cruel enough to get themselves fired. Just a low chuckle passed between Deke Sullivan and Roy Pratt as they leaned against the corral fence, watching the driver help a heavy-set woman down from the coach step by careful step. "Recon." "So," Deke said. "Boss said he hired somebody out of Bozeman. Didn't say she'd need a bigger door." Margaret Whitmore heard every word. She always did. 28 years of living in a body the world had decided to comment on had given her ears sharp enough to catch a whisper across a stockyard. She smoothed her traveling dress, picked up her carpet bag in one hand and a small wooden case in the other, and walked toward the men without breaking stride. "Morning," she said, her voice even, pleasant even. "I'm looking for Thomas Callahan." Roy straightened up fast, caught off guard that she'd walked straight at them instead of shrinking away. "He's up at the house, ma'am." But he glanced at Deke, unsure whether to say it out loud. "You sure you're here for the cook job? Kitchen works hard on a body." "Long hours, heavy pots." Margaret didn't blink. "I've been cooking for working men since I was 14 years old, mister. I imagine I know exactly how heavy the pots get." She walked past them before either man could think of a reply, her boots steady on the packed dirt, her chin level. Behind her, she heard Dake mutter something to Roy that she chose not to hear. Some battles weren't worth turning around for, not on the first day. Thomas Callahan was standing on the porch of the Payne house when she came up the path, a tall man in his late 30s with the kind of weathered, sun-browned face that came from 12 years of running cattle instead of a desk. He had his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, and when he saw her, something flickered across his face, surprise, quickly buried, the way a man buries most things he doesn't want seen. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked. "Margaret's fine." He extended a hand, and to his credit, he shook hers firm and quick, no hesitation, no lingering stare at her size the way some men did. "You made good time from Bozeman. Coach was on schedule." Rare thing these days. A ghost of a smile crossed his mouth. "Gone as fast as it came. Kitchen's out back past the bunkhouse. I'll have someone show you where you're bunking. Fair warning, we run 11 men on this ranch during roundup season, and 11 men eat like it's their last meal on earth every single time. You up for that? I've fed 40 men a day at a logging camp in the Bitterroots, mister." Callahan. 11'll be a rest. That earned her a longer look this time, not the kind that measured her waistline, but the kind that measured her nerve. "All right then," he said. "Kitchen's yours. Books are in the drawer by the stove, supply orders, deliveries, what we're spending. Take a look when you get settled. I like my cook to know where the money goes, since half of it goes into her kitchen." Margaret nodded once. I like knowing that too. She didn't know it yet, but that single sentence would be the thread that unraveled everything. The kitchen was smaller than she'd hoped and dirtier than she'd expected, which told her plenty about the cook who'd come before her. Gone now. Nobody said where. Nobody said why. And Margaret had learned a long time ago not to ask too many questions on her first day. She spent the afternoon scrubbing the stove, reorganizing shelves that made no sense, and sorting through a drawer stuffed with crumpled receipts and delivery slips that looked like they'd been shoved in there by someone who couldn't be bothered to care. It was near sundown, with supper already simmering, when she found the first thing that didn't sit right. A receipt from Ward Supply dated 3 weeks back. 50 pounds of flour, billed at nearly double what Margaret had paid for the same amount back in Bozeman just that morning. She frowned, set it aside and kept sorting. Found another. Then another. A delivery of salt pork that was supposedly 40 pounds, but a scrawled in the corner not name handwriting as the invoice read only 33 reist. 7 pounds vanished into thin air, and somebody had paid for meat that never arrived. Margaret sat back on her heels in front of that drawer for a long moment, her mind doing the kind of quiet, careful math it had done 100 times before, in another life, in another kitchen, behind another set of books that hadn't added up either. Not again, she thought. Please, not again. But she didn't say anything. Not that first night. She served supper beef stew thick enough to stand a spoon in, biscuits that made even Deke Sullivan go quiet mid-chew, and she watched, and she listened, and she said nothing at all. By the end of her second week, Margaret had a system. She kept her own ledger now, hidden in the wooden case she'd carried off the stagecoach, separate from the ranch's books. Every delivery, she weighed herself before it went into the pantry. Every invoice, she compared against the prices she knew from her own year's buying supplies. And every single time the numbers from Ward Supply came back wrong. Never wildly wrong, never enough to make a busy rancher stop and squint twice at his ledger. Just wrong enough every time in Ward's favor. She said nothing to Thomas. Not yet. A woman accusing a respected merchant with nothing but a stack of her own scribbled notes would be laughed off the ranch faster than she'd been laughed onto it. She needed more. She needed proof so solid not even a skeptical man could argue his way around it. What she didn't account for was how fast a rancher's patience could run out when his ledgers looked like they were bleeding money and he didn't yet know why. "Cookhouse spending's up again," Thomas said one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway with his own book open in his hands, his jaw tight in a way Margaret hadn't seen from him before. 3rd month running. Margaret didn't stop stirring the pot in front of her. "I've noticed that too. You've noticed." His voice had an edge now. "Margaret, I hired you because I needed someone who'd run this kitchen tight. Instead, I'm looking at numbers worse than they were before you got here." She finally looked up at him, and something in her calm seemed to frustrate him more than if she'd argued. "The numbers you're looking at aren't mine, Thomas. They're what Ward Supply is charging you. I've been buying the same goods for less coin my whole life. Something's wrong on his end, not mine. Ward's been supplying this ranch since before I inherited it from my father. Man's never cheated me a day in his life. I'm not saying he's cheating you to your face. I'm saying the invoices don't match the deliveries, and they haven't matched once since I started keeping track." Thomas's grip tightened on the doorframe. "You've been keeping track." "Every day. Without telling me. I was gathering proof before I brought you a guest dressed up as a fact." "That's not the same as hiding some, Thomas, and you know it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, one of the ranch hands laughed at something, the sound carrying thin through the evening air, and Margaret watched Thomas's face cycle through something complicated: anger, doubt, and underneath it, something that looked almost like fear. A man who'd trusted the wrong person before didn't like being told he might be doing it again. "Show me," he said finally. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the drawer, pulling out the small stack of receipts she'd been collecting. She laid them on the table one by one, and beside each, a scrap of paper in her own hand noting what she'd actually paid, actually weighed, actually counted. Thomas studied them in silence for a long time. Long enough that Margaret's heart started to hope that maybe this wasn't going to end the way she'd feared, hope that maybe he was a man who could look at facts and change his mind because of them. Then he closed the ledger with a snap. "This isn't enough." "Thomas,
You've been here 2 weeks, Margaret. Elias Ward's been doing business with my family for 15 years.
You want me to believe a man I've known half my life's cheating me, based on a handful of receipts and your say-so?" "I'm not asking you to believe me blind, I'm asking you to look closer. I've got a ranch to run, not a mystery to solve." His voice rose now, frustration finally breaking through the calm he'd been holding on to. You know what it looks like from where I'm standing? It looks like a new cook whose kitchen is running over budget, trying to point the finger somewhere else before I start asking why. The words landed harder than Margaret expected, and for one dangerous second, something in her chest wanted to crumble the way it might have years ago, back when she was younger, and every accusation still had the power to make her doubt herself. But she was not that woman anymore. She had buried that woman a long time ago, in a small store in Ohio that closed its doors because nobody believed her father either, until it was too late. She set her jaw and looked Thomas Callahan dead in the eye. You can believe whatever you want about me, Thomas Callahan. That's your right. But I did not travel 200 miles to cook meals for men who think a woman my size is too soft-headed to read a ledger straight. I know numbers. I have known numbers since I was a girl standing behind my daddy's counter, watching a supplier smile in his face while he robbed him blind. I watched it happen once already, and I did not have the words to stop it. I am not that girl anymore. So you go ahead and doubt me if that's easier than doubting a man you've trusted for 15 years. But don't you dare stand in my kitchen and tell me the numbers are wrong when I am the only one in this house who has bothered to check them. The kitchen went dead silent. Thomas stared at her, and something in his expression cracked open just slightly, not enough to be an apology. Not yet, but enough that Margaret could see she'd struck something true in him. That's a hell of a speech for a cook, he said, finally quiet now. I'm more than a cook. Clearly, he picked his ledger back up, tucking it under his arm, but he lingered in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to. I'm not saying you're wrong, Margaret. I'm saying I need more than a feeling before I ride into town and accuse Elias Ward of stealing from me. Man's got friends. Got a reputation. You understand what that means out here? I understand it means people believe the man with the good name over the woman who's been in town 2 weeks. I've understood that my whole life, Thomas. Doesn't make it right. He didn't have an answer for that. He simply nodded once and walked out into the dark. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen a long while after he left, her hands braced on the edge of the table, her breath coming slower now that the fight had gone out of the room. She looked down at the receipts still spread across the wood, evidence that wasn't enough, proof that wasn't proof, not yet. Fine, she thought, then I'll get more. The next morning, Margaret woke before the sun, same as always, and found the kitchen already occupied. Deke Sullivan sat at the small table in the corner, hat off, looking distinctly uncomfortable to be caught there. Didn't mean to startle you, he said. You're up early for a man who doesn't much care for the cook, Margaret said, tying her apron. Deke had the decency to look ashamed, yeah. About that, he turned his hat over in his hands, studying it like it held the words he was looking for. Roy and I, we said some things that first day. Wasn't right of us. Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting. Thing is, Deke went on, I've been on this ranch 6 years. Watched 3 cooks come and go, and not a one have ever noticed what you noticed inside 2 weeks. He glanced towards the door, lowering his voice. I heard you and the boss talking last night. Walls in this house ain't as thick as folks think. And I've hauled deliveries from Ward Supply plenty of times. There's been a few I didn't think much of it before. Figured I'd just miscounted where the sacks felt lighter than what the paper said. Wasn't my place. Margaret went very still. You're saying you've seen it too. I'm saying maybe I have, and maybe I was too dumb or too lazy to put a name to it till you did. Deke stood hat back on his head now, some of his earlier awkwardness settling into something steadier. I laughed at you that first day 'cause I didn't know you. I'm not laughing now. If you're fixing to prove something about Ward, I'll tell you what I remember. Might not be much, but it's yours if you want it. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Margaret Whitmore felt something loosen in her chest, not victory, not yet, but the first thread of an ally in a place that had given her nothing but doubt. I want it, she said. Every bit of it. Over the following days, Margaret's careful, quiet notebook grew thicker. Deke remembered dates. On the other hand, a quiet young man named Sam, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, remembered a conversation he'd overheard between Elias Ward and a rider from the Delacroix, spread 2 counties over a conversation about prices. About margins. About a man Ward called an old fool who never checks his own books too close. Sam hadn't thought much of it at the time. He thought plenty of it now. Margaret wrote it all down in her small, careful hand. Names, dates, amounts, weights that didn't match invoices. Invoices that didn't match deliveries. Deliveries always came up just short enough to be missed by a busy man running a whole ranch on his own. She did not go back to Thomas right away. She had learned that lesson already. A stack of half-proof was worse than no proof at all, because it gave a doubting man an easy reason to keep on doubting. So she waited, and she gathered, and she cooked, and she watched the ranch hands who had laughed at her that first morning, slowly one by one, start pulling their chairs a little closer to her fire in the evenings. Start asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with supper. It was Roy Pratt, of all people the one who'd made the crack about doors, who came to her nearly 2 weeks later with the piece that would change everything. "Ma'am," he said, catching her alone by the woodpile one evening, hat in his hands the same nervous way Deke's had been. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you throw a log at my head for what I said that first day." Margaret almost smiled. "I got a cousin works over at the Delacroix Ranch. Writes me letters now and again. Couple months back she mentioned they'd let their cook go. Said the woman kept complaining the kitchen budget didn't add up, kept saying somebody was cheating them on supplies. Delacroix didn't want to hear it. Fired her instead of looking into it." Margaret's breath caught. Fired her. Called her a troublemaker. "Same supplier, ma'am. Same Ward supply wagon that comes through here." The pieces Margaret had been lied assembling for weeks suddenly clicked together with a force that nearly took her breath away. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a single act of greed against one ranch that trusted too easily. This was a pattern, a careful, patient pattern, repeated across more than one spread, hidden behind good manners and a familiar face and 15 years of earned trust. And somewhere out there was a woman, another cook, who'd seen the same thing Margaret had seen, said the same thing Margaret was about to say, and been thrown off her ranch for the trouble of telling the truth. Margaret set her jaw. She was not going to end up like that woman. And she was not going to let Thomas Callahan end up like a man who'd been quietly bled dry by someone he called a friend. "Roy," she said, "I need you to write to your cousin. I need her name, the dates, anything she remembers." "Can you do that?" "Already asked her twice, ma'am." Figured you'd want it. Something in Margaret's chest ached at that, not sadness exactly, but the particular, startling warmth of being believed by someone who hadn't believed her at all just a few weeks before. "Thank you, Roy. Don't thank me yet." He settled his hat back on his head, glancing toward the house, where lamplight glowed behind the kitchen window. "Boss is going to have to hear this sooner or later. And when Ward finds out what you've been doing, man's not going to take kindly to it. He's got friends in this territory. Powerful ones." Margaret looked out toward the dark line of the horizon, toward the direction, she supposed, of Ward's warehouse somewhere beyond the ridge, and felt something settle inside her, not fear. Though fear had every right to be there, but something steadier. Something closer to resolve. "Let him have his friends," she said quietly. "I've got the truth. That's outlasted worse men than Elias Ward before." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her notebook heavy in her apron pocket, the weight of it feeling less like a burden now, and more like a promise to herself, to the cook at Delacroix who'd been silenced before her, and to a ranch full of people who were about to find out exactly how much they'd underestimated the woman they'd laughed at on her very first day. Behind her, the lamp in the kitchen window burned steady against the coming dark, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Margaret Whitmore allowed herself to believe she might actually win. Roy's letter came back inside 4 days, delivered by a rider passing through from the county seat, and Margaret's hands weren't quite steady when she broke the seal. She read it standing at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, Roy hovering near the door like a man waiting on a jury's verdict. "Well?" he asked, when she didn't say anything for too long. Her name was Hattie Vance. Margaret's voice came out quiet. "Cooked for Delacroix 3 years. Cousin says Hattie kept records same as I have kept 'em in a tin under her bed, if you can believe that, because she didn't trust Delacroix's foreman not to burn 'em. says Ward's man showed up with a wagon short on grain twice in 1 month, and when Hattie said something, Delacroix called her hysterical. Fired her inside a week. Cousin says nobody's heard from Hattie since. Left the territory. Roy pulled his hat off and turned it slow in his hands, the way he did when something sat wrong with him. Left the territory or made to leave it. Margaret looked up at him. That's exactly what I'm asking myself, Roy. She folded the letter with careful hands, the kind of careful a person used on something that might shatter, and tucked it into her wooden case beside the rest, the receipts, the mismatched weights. Sam's overheard conversation, Deke's memory of light sacks. A pile that had started as suspicion and was growing day by day into something with teeth. You're going to show the boss, Roy said. It wasn't a question. I am. Tonight? Margaret glanced toward the window, toward the dark shape of the main house across the yard, lamplight glowing gold behind Thomas Callahan's study window, same as it did most nights past supper. Tonight, she said. She found him at his desk, ledger open, a half-drunk cup of coffee gone cold beside his elbow, and the moment he looked up and saw her face, something in his own expression braced itself. You've got that look, he said. What look? The one you had the night you told me my numbers were wrong. He set down his pen. Go on, then. Let's hear it. Margaret laid the letter on his desk without preamble, then set the wooden case beside it and opened the lid. Her name's Hattie Vance. Cooked for the Delacroix spread 2 ranches over. She found the same pattern I found light deliveries, invoices that didn't match. Prices crept up slow enough nobody'd notice unless they were counting close. She told Delacroix. Delacroix fired her for it, called her a troublemaker, and now nobody in this territory's heard from her in months. Thomas read the letter twice. Margaret watched his jaw work, watched the color shift under that weathered skin, watched a man's certainty crack a little more with every line. This is one letter, he said finally, but there wasn't much fight left in his voice. One cousin's account, secondhand. It's the same pattern, Thomas. Same wagon, same supplier. Same story, ending the same way a woman tells the truth, and the man who owns the ranch decides it's easier to believe his old friend than the woman who's only been there a year. The words landed harder than she'd meant them to, and she watched them land, watched Thomas flinch like she'd caught him somewhere tender. He was quiet a long moment, staring down at his own ledger, like the numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. You think that's what I'm doing, he said. Same as Delacroix. I think you're scared to be wrong about a man you've trusted 15 years. That's not the same as being cruel, Thomas. But it can end up looking a whole lot like it if you let the fear win out over the facts. He didn't answer right away. He got up from behind the desk instead, crossed to the window, stood there with his back to her, hand rested on the sill, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped into something rougher, something Margaret hadn't heard from him before. You want to know something about this ranch? Nobody else knows, he said. We're in debt. Not a little. My father borrowed heavy against the land the last 2 years of his life, trying to keep the herd up during the drought, and when he died it landed on me, all of it. Every note, every payment. I've been keeping this place afloat on thinner margins than anybody in this valley knows about. If the kitchen's been bleeding money for months on top of everything else, and it turns out that's not bad management, that's not a cook running wasteful, that's theft. On top of debt I'm already drowning in. Stopped himself, dragged a hand down his face. You understand what I'm telling you? If you're right, Margaret, it's not just embarrassing. It might be the difference between keeping this ranch and losing it. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, not triumph. Nothing so simple as being right. Something closer to grief on his behalf, and underneath that, a fierce, sudden resolve. Then you cannot afford to keep doubting me, she said. You can't afford it, Thomas. Not for your pride, and not for your loyalty to a man who may have been robbing you blind while you called him a friend. He turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Callahan Creek, there was nothing guarded in his eyes at all. Just a kind of raw, frightened honesty that made him look younger than his years. What do you need from me? He asked. Time, and your trust, not blind trust. I'm not asking for that. Just enough that you stop standing in my way while I finish building something Ward can't argue his way around." "You've got it," Thomas said both. The next morning, Margaret rode into town for the first time since she'd arrived, tucked into the wagon seat beside Sam, who'd volunteered before she'd even finished asking. The county seat wasn't large, a strip of buildings along a single dusty street, a bank, a land office, a mercantile, a sheriff's office with its door propped open to the heat, but it was large enough to hold the kind of records Margaret needed. She started at the land office, where a clerk named Mr. Whitfield, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched low on his nose, seemed genuinely startled that anyone had come asking about supply contracts filed with the county. "Most folks don't bother," he said, pulling a heavy ledger down from a shelf. "What exactly are you looking for, ma'am?" "Any record of Ward Supply's contracts with ranches in this valley. Delacroix, Callahan Creek, any others he's done business with these past 3-4 years." Whitfield's eyebrows rose, but he didn't ask why, just licked his thumb and started paging through entries in a careful, unhurried hand. Margaret waited, her pulse ticking faster than she let show on her face, and when he finally turned the ledger toward her, she felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her. Ward Supply held contracts with 6 ranches across the valley. 6, and beside 3 of those names, Delacroix, Hartwell, and a smaller outfit called the Reardon place, someone had scrawled a small notation in the margin. "Contract renegotiated. Reduced acreage." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, tapping the notation. "Reduced acreage?" Whitfield adjusted his spectacles, peering closer. "Means the ranch sold off land. Happens sometimes. When an outfit's struggling, they sell a parcel to cover debts, keep the rest running smaller." "Sold to who?" He flipped back a page, ran his finger down a column, and went very still. "All 3 parcels," he said slowly, "sold to the same buyer. Fella named Harrison Cole, land agent out of Helena." He looked up at Margaret, something uneasy creeping into his expression now. "That's a strange coincidence, ma'am. 3 ranches struggling enough to sell off good grazing land, all landing with the same buyer inside 2 years. Margaret felt something cold and clear settle over her, the particular stillness that came when a suspicion hardened into certainty. This wasn't simple greed. This wasn't a merchant skimming a little extra off every wagon load because he thought nobody was counting. This was patient, deliberate, a slow bleed designed to weaken ranch after ranch until their owners had no choice but to sell land that then landed, every single time, in the hands of the very same buyer. "Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully, "is there any way to find out who Harrison Cole is actually buying that land for? Land agents don't usually buy for themselves. They buy for somebody with money behind them." Whitfield hesitated, glancing toward the door, like he expected someone to be listening. "That's not information the county keeps on file, ma'am. You'd have to ask in Helena." And even then he lowered his voice. "Folks don't much like being asked those kinds of questions. I'd be careful who you go asking if I were you." Margaret thanked him, gathered what notes she could copy down quickly, and walked back out into the street with Sam trailing a step behind, his young face drawn tight with the same unease she felt settling into her own bones. "Ma'am," Sam said quietly, once they were out of earshot of the land office, "that's an awful lot bigger than a cook cheating on flour prices." "It is," Margaret said. "Which means we've been asking the wrong question this whole time, Sam. We've been asking who's stealing from Callahan Creek. We should have been asking who wants Callahan Creek to fail." She was still turning that thought over when they passed the mercantile, and it was there, stepping out the front door with a parcel under one arm and a smile already forming, that Elias Ward himself nearly walked straight into her. He recovered quick, men like Ward always did, tipping his hat with a warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Whitmore. Didn't expect to see Callahan's new cook all the way out here." "Needed supplies the ranch kitchen was short on," Margaret said, keeping her voice light, giving nothing away. "Figured I'd see the town while I was at it." Wise woman. Ward's gaze flicked, brief but deliberate, toward the land office behind her. "Whitfield keep you long? Man does love to talk once he gets going on those old ledgers of his." Margaret felt the hair on her arms rise. It was a casual question. It was also not a casual question at all, and she understood in that instant that Elias Ward exactly where she'd spent her morning. He was helpful, she said simply. I'll bet he was. Ward's smile held a moment longer than comfortable. You know, Miss Whitmore, I've been doing business in this valley a long time. Longer than you've been alive, I'd wager. Folks round here know me. Trust me. That kind of trust, it's not built overnight, and it's not something a person ought to go around questioning without real cause. He adjusted his hat, his voice dropping into something softer, almost fatherly, and all the more unsettling for it. I'd hate for a hard-working young woman to go stirring up trouble on a hunch and find out the hard way that territory doesn't take kindly to folks who make accusations they can't back up. Man's reputation is a fragile thing out here. So's a woman's position, come to that. The threat sat there between them, wrapped in courtesy, and Margaret held his gaze without so much as a flicker. I don't deal in hunches, Mr. Ward, she said. I deal in numbers. And numbers, unlike reputations, don't lie. Something shifted behind his eyes fast, gone almost before she caught it, but she caught it all the same. Not the look of an innocent man mildly annoyed by an unfair accusation. The look of a man recalculating. Give my regards to Thomas, Ward said, tipping his hat once more, and walked on down the street without waiting for her reply. Sam let out a breath beside her once Ward was well out of earshot. Ma'am, I don't like the way that man looked at you. Neither do I, Margaret said, which tells me we're closer to the truth than he'd like. Ward beat them back to the ranch. Margaret didn't know whether he'd sent a rider ahead or simply ridden hard himself, but by the time the wagon rolled through the Callahan Creek gate, his own wagon was already tied up outside the main house. And Ward himself was sitting on the porch across from Thomas, coffee in hand, looking for all the world like an old friend paying a neighborly visit. Margaret. Thomas stood when he saw her, and something tighter in eyes told her this wasn't the friendly conversation Ward was performing for anyone watching. Elias was just telling me about your visit to town today. Was he? Margaret climbed down from the wagon, smoothing her skirts, keeping her voice even despite the way her pulse had kicked up hard. Is all, Ward said smoothly, not rising from his chair. Man hears his cook's been over at the land office, asking pointed questions about his business dealings. Natural he'd want to clear the air with an old friend, before things get twisted around into something ugly. I wasn't asking about your business dealings, Mr. Ward, Margaret said. I was asking about supply contracts filed with the county. Public record. Anyone's free to look, of course they are. Ward's smile didn't waver, but his knuckles had gone a little white around the coffee cup. Just seems an odd way for a cook to spend her morning off, is all I'm saying. Thomas's gaze moved between them, and Margaret could see him weighing something not quite doubt anymore. Not the way it had been that first week, but something more careful. A man trying to read two people telling different versions of the same story and figure out which one was lying. Elias, Thomas said slowly, why don't you tell me straight? Is there a reason Margaret shouldn't be looking at contracts filed with the county? Ward laughed, easy. Practiced. No reason at all, Thomas, other than it's a strange use of a hard-working woman's time, and I'd hate for her to go making a fool of herself chasing shadows. You remember what happened over at Delacroix Place, don't you? Cook there got it in her head somebody was cheating the ranch, went around town making noise about it, turned out to be nothing but a woman who couldn't manage a budget, looking for somebody else to blame. Delacroix had to let her go over it, ugly business. Wouldn't want to see the same thing happen here, over what's likely nothing more than an honest bookkeeping mistake on my end. Margaret felt her pulse spike hot and sharp, because there it was the same story, twisted just enough to sound reasonable. Aimed straight at planting doubt in Thomas's mind, using the very woman Margaret had been trying to prove was telling the truth. That's not what happened to Hattie Vance, Margaret said, before she could stop herself, and watched something flicker across Ward's face at the sound of the name fast controlled. But there. I don't believe I said her name, Ward said quietly. The porch went very still. No, Margaret said, you didn't. For one long moment, nobody spoke. Thomas looked between the two of them, And Margaret could see the exact instant something clicked into place behind his eyes, the same instant Ward seemed to realize he'd made a mistake, however small, however easily explained away later. Ward recovered fast, setting his coffee cup down with a careless little clink. "Small territory, Miss Whitmore. Word travels. I make it my business to know what's said about my company, that's all." He stood, brushing off his trousers, his smile settling back into place like a mask returning to a familiar shape. "Thomas, I'll let you get back to your evening. Do think on what I said. Wouldn't want to see anybody round here get hurt over a misunderstanding." He tipped his hat to Margaret slower this time, deliberate, and walked to his wagon without another word. Nobody moved until the sound of his wheels faded down the road. "He knew her name," Thomas said, finally, his voice low. "He knew her name," Margaret agreed. Thomas turned to look at her, and this time there was no hesitation in his face at all. None of the careful skepticism she'd been fighting through for weeks. "Margaret, tell me everything you found today. All of it. Don't leave anything out." So she did the land office, the 6 contracts, the 3 parcels of land sold off cheap by struggling ranches, all of it landing in the hands of the same buyer out of Helena. A man named Harrison Cole, who almost certainly wasn't spending his own money. By the time she finished, the sun had gone down and the lamp on the porch had burned low, and Thomas Callahan sat very still in his chair, staring out at the dark shape of his own land, like he was seeing it differently for the first time. "He's not just stealing," Thomas said slowly. "He's starving ranches out. Making them weak enough they've got no choice but to sell. That's what I think, yes. And if he's been doing it 3-4 years, quiet enough nobody's put the pieces together." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Margaret, how close are we to that ranch selling? To this one?" Margaret hesitated, because she'd done that math too, walking back from town, turning his own words from the night before over in her head thinner margins than anybody in this valley knows about. "Closer than I'd like," she admitted quietly. "If the kitchen's been overcharged for months, and that's only one piece of what he's likely doing across the whole ranch, the cattle feed, the tools, anything else that runs through Ward Supply, then no, Thomas. I don't think you've got years to figure this out. I think you've got a season, maybe less." Thomas was quiet a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way Margaret hadn't heard from him before, something that sounded almost like fear finally let loose. "My father built this place from nothing," he said. 22 years he built it, and I have spent the last 3 trying not to be the man who loses it. And now you're telling me the reason I might lose it isn't drought, isn't bad luck, isn't anything I could have fought fair. It's a man I called my friend, quietly bleeding me dry while I shook his hand." "I'm telling you we caught it," Margaret said, and something in her voice made him look up at her. "I'm telling you, Hattie Vance didn't have anybody standing beside her when she found the same thing. You do." Something passed between them then, quiet and unspoken, and Thomas Callahan reached out, not quite touching her, just close enough that Margaret felt the warmth of it before he seemed to catch himself and pulled back, clearing his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a real one, not the half one I gave you before. I judged you the first morning you walked onto this ranch, same as every fool who laughed at you by that corral. I told myself it was about the ledgers, about the money, but the truth is I looked at you and made up my mind about what you could and couldn't handle before you'd said a single word to me. That was wrong of me, Margaret. I'm sorry for it." Margaret felt something tighten in her throat, something she hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication, not exactly. Something warmer than that, and more dangerous, because a woman who'd spent her whole life building walls against exactly this kind of moment knew better than to let one apology knock them all down at once. "Apology accepted," she said carefully. "Now let's talk about what we do next, before Ward decides he's got more to lose from letting us keep asking questions than he does from stopping us outright." They didn't have to wait long to find out what that might look like. Margaret woke before dawn 3 days later to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, not the ordinary kind that curled up from the kitchen stove every morning of her life. This was far sharper, wrong, and it yanked her out of sleep with her heart already hammering before her feet hit the floor. She was out the door in her nightclothes, bare feet slapping against packed dirt, and the sight that met her stopped her cold. The supply shed, the small outbuilding where the ranch's grain stores, its flour, its dried goods stood wreathed in smoke, orange light licking up along one wall. "Fire!" she screamed, the word tearing out of her raw and loud enough to wake the whole ranch. Fire in the supply shed. Men came pouring out of the bunkhouse, half-dressed, Deke first among them, already running for the water barrels, shouting orders in a voice gone hoarse with urgency. Thomas came out of the main house at a dead sprint, hair wild, buttoning his shirt as he ran, and for a long, terrible stretch of minutes the whole ranch became a chain of buckets and shouting, and the roar of flame fighting back against water thrown too slow, too little, too late. They saved the shed barely. What they didn't save was most of what was stored inside it, nearly 2 months of grain, flour, dried meat, all of it either burned or ruined by smoke and water, a loss that Margaret understood. Even standing there, soot-streaked and shaking in the gray light of dawn, would hit the ranch's already thin margins like a hammer blow. "Lantern," Deke said grimly, crouched near the shed's ruined doorway, holding up a blackened, twisted piece of metal. Somebody left a lantern burning in there overnight. Or somebody wanted it to look that way. Thomas took the ruined lantern from him, turning it over in his hands, his face gone hard and still in a way Margaret hadn't seen before. "Nobody on this ranch is fool enough to leave a lit lantern in a shed full of dry grain," he said. "No, sir," Deke agreed quietly. "Not one." Margaret felt the cold certainty settle into her bones even before anyone said the name out loud. She looked toward the tree line at the edge of the property, toward the road that led, eventually, to Elias Ward's warehouse, and felt something in her chest go tight and furious. "He's telling us he can reach us," she said. "That's what this is. Not really about the grain, not even about the money. He's telling us he can burn something down whenever he pleases, and there's not a thing we can do to stop him because we can't prove he did it, any more than he could easily prove he didn't." Thomas's grip tightened around the ruined lantern until his knuckles went white. "Then we make sure the next thing we bring him isn't a stack of receipts he can wave off as coincidence. We bring him something he can't wriggle out of." But not everyone on the ranch was ready to believe the fire had anything to do with Elias Ward at all. It was a hand named Curly Watts, older than most of the crew, quiet, kept mostly to himself, who spoke up loudest against the idea, cornering Margaret near the well 2 days after the fire while she was hauling water for the half-rebuilt kitchen stores. "You want my opinion, ma'am," he said, not waiting to be asked for it. "I think you've got half this ranch chasing ghosts. Fire could have been 100 things. Careless hand, dry summer, sparks off the chimney catching the wrong wind. Man's been supplying this valley 15 years without trouble, and now suddenly he's burning down sheds because a cook doesn't like his prices." Margaret started, but Curly kept talking right over her, his voice rising. "I've known Elias Ward longer than you've been in this territory, ma'am, with all due respect. He stood up 2 churches worth of charity, helped bury half the folks in this valley who couldn't afford their own funerals, and you're standing telling grown men he's out here burning down grain sheds like some kind of outlaw. Seems to me somebody ought to ask why a woman who's been here 2 months is so quick to believe the worst of a man half this territory calls a friend." Something in his voice had an edge to it that didn't sit right with Margaret, not simple, stubborn loyalty. Something closer to defensiveness, and she filed that feeling away even as she kept her voice level. "I'm not asking anyone to believe anything they haven't seen with their own eyes, Curly. I'm asking Thomas to look at facts before he decides what's true. That's all I've ever asked, facts." Curly spat the word like it tasted bad. "Facts didn't burn down that shed. Somebody's carelessness did, most likely, and now you've got the whole crew looking sideways at a man who's never done a thing to earn it." He stalked off before Margaret could answer, and she stood there by the well a long moment, turning his outburst over in her mind, something uneasy prickling at the back of her thoughts that she couldn't quite name yet. It was Sam, of all people, quiet Sam, who rarely offered an opinion unasked, who found her later that evening and said the thing that turned her unease into something sharper. "Ma'am," he said, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke, voice pitched low, You ought to know Curly's been getting his tobacco and his whiskey on credit from Ward Supply going on 2 years now. More than credit if what I've heard is true. Man's in debt to Ward pretty deep. Deep enough that if Ward Supply ever called in what's owed all at once, Curly'd likely lose everything he's got saved up. Margaret went very still. You're saying Curly's got reason to defend Ward besides simple friendship? I'm saying a man beholden to another man tends to see what that man wants him to see, ma'am. Whether he means to or not. Sam shifted, uncomfortable. Might be nothing, might just be an old man loyal to a friend. But you asked me to tell you things I noticed, and that's a thing I noticed. Margaret thanked him and stood alone a long while after he'd gone, staring out toward the dark tree line at the edge of the property, and felt the shape of something larger and more dangerous settling into view, not just a merchant quietly cheating ranchers out of their land, but a web of debts and favors and quiet loyalties stretched across the whole valley. Invisible until you knew to look for the threads. If Ward had Curly this deep in his pocket, she thought, who else did he have? And how far would any of them go, if Ward asked it of them? The answer to that question came faster than she wanted it to. 4 days after the fire, Margaret rode out with Deke to check the ranch's northern fence line, a routine task that had become anything but routine since the shed burned. Every ordinary chore now carrying an undercurrent of watchfulness that hadn't existed before. They found the fence cut in 3 places, cattle scattered across 2 miles of open range, and tracks, careful, deliberate tracks leading off toward the county road. Ain't no accident, Deke said grimly, crouched by the cut wire, running his thumb along the clean edge. Wires cut with shears, not busted by weather or a spooked steer. Somebody did this on purpose, and recent tracks are maybe a day old, no more. Margaret felt her stomach drop even as her mind raced ahead, cold and clear. How many head did we lose? Won't know till we round 'em up. Could be a dozen. Could be more if I wandered far enough to get picked off by somebody who knew exactly where a fence been cut and exactly when to be waiting. The implication sat between them, ugly and plain. This wasn't random mischief. This was theft dressed up to look like an accident, timed to hit a ranch already reeling from a fire that had gutted its grain stores. They spent the rest of the day and half the next rounding up scattered cattle, and by the time the count came back, Thomas's face had gone the particular gray of a man watching his life's work bleed out from a dozen small wounds at once. 9 head missing outright. More strayed far enough to be lamed or lost to coyotes before they were found. That's not carelessness, Thomas said that night, pacing the length of his study, while Margaret sat with her ledger open on her lap, tallying losses that grew heavier by the hour. Fire then fence cut inside a week, that's not bad luck twice in a row. That's a man telling me exactly what he's capable of and daring me to prove it. Then we stop trying to prove what he's capable of, Margaret said, and start proving what he's already done. Thomas stopped pacing. Meaning? Meaning the fire and the fence, we may never pin on him no witness, no confession, nothing but timing too convenient to be coincidence. But the contracts, Thomas, the land sales, Hattie Vance. The mismatched invoices going back years across 6 ranches, all landing in the same buyer's hands. That we can prove, that we've already started proving. She closed her ledger, met his eyes steady across the lamplight. He's trying to scare us into stopping before we finish it. Which tells me we're closer to finishing it than either of us realized. Thomas studied her a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You're not afraid of him, he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. I'm plenty afraid of him, Margaret said honestly. I've watched what men like Elias Ward do to people who stand in their way. I watched it happen to my own father, and it broke something in him he never got back. So yes, Thomas, I'm afraid. But I learned a long time ago that being afraid and being wrong aren't the same thing, and I'll be damned if I let fear talk me into silence twice in one lifetime. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, then not quite a smile, too grave a moment for that, but something warm and fierce all at once. The look of a man seeing someone clearly for the first time, and finding he liked what he saw far more than he'd expected to. All right then, he said quietly. We finish it. They started that same night, laying out everything Margaret had gathered across the study table, in careful, methodical order the receipts, the mismatched weights, Hattie Vance's letter, the land office records, the pattern of 6 contracts, and 3 land sales, all leading back to a buyer in Helena who almost certainly wasn't spending his own money. "We need more than what we've got," Margaret said, tapping the stack. "This proves a pattern to anyone willing to look close. It doesn't prove Ward's behind the land sale specifically, not in a way a judge or a territorial marshal couldn't argue around. We need to know who Harrison Cole is really buying for." "Then we go to Helena," Thomas said. "We can't both go. Somebody needs to run this ranch, and after a fire and a cut fence, I don't like the idea of leaving it unwatched." Thomas considered that, jaw tight. "Deke can hold things down here a few days. I'll ride to Helena myself, see what I can dig up on Harrison Cole. You keep working the numbers, keep building what we've got here at home." And Margaret paused, something careful entering his voice. "While I'm gone, watch yourself. Ward already knows you've been asking questions. If he's willing to burn a shed and cut a fence to slow us down, I don't like leaving you here without knowing you're being careful." "I'm always careful, Thomas." "Careful didn't stop that fire from happening 10 yards from where you sleep." His voice had gone rougher now, something underneath the words that Margaret recognized, with a small jolt, as something closer to fear for her than fear for the ranch. "I mean it. Watch yourself." "I will," she said softly, and found she meant it more for his sake than her own. Thomas left for Helena 3 mornings later, and the ranch without him felt strange in a way Margaret hadn't expected, quieter, but not stful. Every sound at night now carrying the possibility of another fence cut, another fire, another small cruelty designed to remind them exactly how exposed they were. She threw herself into the work instead of dwelling on it, cross-referencing every invoice she'd gathered, building a timeline stretching back nearly 4 years, watching the pattern sharpen with every new piece of paper, prices rising in small, careful increments, always timed a month or 2 after a ranch had taken on new debt, always calibrated to squeeze without quite breaking, until the moment a struggling owner finally reached for the only relief available: selling off a parcel of good land to an agent who always seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right offer. It was Deke who found her hunched over the study table past midnight on the 3rd day of Thomas's absence, papers spread in careful rows, her eyes burning from hours of close work by lamplight. "You ought to sleep, ma'am," he said gently, setting a fresh cup of coffee at her elbow anyway, understanding well enough that she wouldn't take his advice. "Can't," Margaret admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see numbers. 6 ranches, Deke, 6. And I'd wager my life there's more out there we haven't found yet. Spreads too far from here for word to have reached us." Deke pulled out the chair across from her and sat uninvited but not unwelcome, turning his hat over slow in his hands the way he always did when something weighed on him. "Can I ask you something, ma'am? Go ahead. That first morning you came off the stagecoach, me and Roy, laughing the way we did. You heard every word of it, didn't you?" Margaret set down her pen. "I did. Why didn't you say nothing? Could have torn a strip off us right there. Wouldn't have been more'n we deserved." She considered the question a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over every hard truth before she spoke it out loud. "Because I learned a long time ago that a man who laughs at you before he knows you isn't worth the breath it takes to argue with, and a man who might come around, given time and proof, well, he's worth waiting for." She glanced up, met Deke's eyes steady. "You came around, Deke. Faster than most. That mattered more to me than the laughing ever hurt." Something passed across Deke's weathered face, something like shame settling next to something like gratitude. "For what it's worth, ma'am, and I know it ain't worth much, coming this late, I'm glad that stagecoach brought you here. This ranch is better for it. I'm better for it." Margaret felt her throat tighten, and she covered by picking her pen back up, returning her eyes to the ledger in front of her, because some kindnesses were easier to receive sideways than head-on. "Get some sleep yourself, Deke," she said, and heard the warmth in her own voice even as she tried to keep it steady. "Long as I've got you and Sam and Roy watching my back, I figure we've got a fighting chance at this." "More'n a fighting chance, ma'am," Deke said, rising, settling his hat back on his head at the doorway. I'd wager on you over Elias Ward any day of the week. Man's got money. You've got the truth. Truth's got a way of outlasting money, way I was raised to see it. He left her alone with the lamp and the ledgers, and that thought sitting warm in her chest, and Margaret worked another hour before exhaustion finally won out. Her head bowed over the papers, the pattern of Elias Ward's slow, patient greed laid bare across the table in her own careful hand. Thomas returned from Helena 5 days later, dust-covered and hollow-eyed from hard riding, and the look on his face when he swung down from his horse told Margaret everything before he said a single word. "Tell me," she said, meeting him in the yard. "Harrison Cole's real enough," Thomas said, voice rough with exhaustion. "Runs a small land office out of Helena, respectable enough on paper. But he doesn't buy land with his own money, Margaret. Never. Every parcel he's purchased these past 4 years, and there's more than the 3 we already knew about, near a dozen scattered across 3 counties. Every one of them's been financed through a single account at the Territorial Trust Bank." He paused, and something dark passed over his face. "An account held under a holding company, Ward Valley Land Company." Margaret felt the last piece slide into place with a force that nearly took her breath away. "Elias Ward," Thomas confirmed grimly. "Man's been quietly buying up half this valley for 4 years, using a hired agent to hide his name from every deed, financing the whole operation off money he's been skimming from ranchers who trusted him." And Margaret. His voice dropped, and for the first time since she'd known him, she heard something close to true fear in it. The clerk at the bank let slip something else before he caught himself and clammed up. "Said Ward's been in twice this month already, asking about the terms on a note held against Callahan Creek." Margaret's blood went cold. "The one my father took out." "The one I've been paying down for 3 years. Thomas's jaw tightened until the muscle stood out sharp beneath his skin. "Ward doesn't just want this ranch to struggle, Margaret. He's found out exactly how deep our debt runs, and he's positioning himself to buy that note outright. If he holds the paper on my father's loan instead of the bank, he can call it due whenever he pleases. He could take this ranch out from under me inside a season, all perfectly legal, all wrapped up in paperwork nobody could argue against." The full shape of Elias Ward's scheme unfolded before Margaret with a clarity that left her almost breathless. Not simple theft, not even simple greed, but a slow, patient 4-year campaign to bleed an entire valley of ranchers dry. Buy up their land, parcel by parcel, through a name that wasn't his own. And now, with Callahan Creek close in for the largest prize of all by quietly purchasing the very debt that hung over Thomas's head. "We're out of time," Margaret said quietly. "Whatever we're going to do, Thomas, we have to do it before that note changes hands. Once Ward holds that paper, proving what he's done won't save the ranch. It'll only prove how he took it." Thomas looked at her, dust-streaked and exhausted, and afraid in a way Margaret suspected he'd rarely let himself be afraid in front of another living soul. And something passed between them in that look that went beyond gratitude, beyond partnership, into territory neither of them had words ready for yet. "Then we move," he said, "tomorrow. We take everything we've got, the contracts, the letter from Hattie Vance, the bank records, all of it, and we ride to the territorial marshal ourselves, before Ward gets 1 hour closer to owning this land out from under me." Margaret nodded, steadying herself against the fear coiling tight in her chest, because she understood, standing there in the fading light with the weight of everything they'd uncovered spread between them, that whatever came next would be the fight that decided everything, not just for Callahan Creek, but for every ranch Elias Ward had quietly starved along the way. And for the memory of a woman named Hattie Vance, who'd tried to tell this same truth once alone and paid for it with everything she had. She would not be alone, and she would not fail the way Hattie had been made to fail. "Tomorrow," Margaret agreed, and felt the words settle into her like a vow. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of chill that settled into a person's bones and made every decision feel heavier than it should. Margaret was awake before the sun again, packing the wooden case with everything they'd gathered: receipts, invoices, Hattie Vance's letter, the county land records, Thomas's careful notes from Helena, when a knock at the kitchen door made her jump hard enough to nearly drop the whole case. It was Curly. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and something in his face looked different this morning, pale, drawn tight, none of the stubborn defiance he'd worn the last time they'd spoken. "Ma'am," he said, "I need a word with you before you and the boss ride out." "Curly, we don't have time, please." The word cracked out of him rough, and Margaret stopped, really looked at him, and saw a man wrestling with something that had clearly cost him sleep. She set the case down. "Go on. I owe Ward money," he said, the confession coming out fast now, like he'd been holding it too long and it had gone rotten inside him. "Been owing him near 2 years. Tobacco, whiskey. A loan I took when my sister took sick back in Ohio, and I needed to send money home fast. Man's never once called in what I owe him, never pressed me on it. I told myself that was kindness." He swallowed hard. "3 nights ago, after the fence got cut, he rode out to see me. Private. Told me he'd heard I'd been talking against you and the boss around the bunkhouse, said he appreciated a man who understood loyalty. Then he told me, real casual-like, that a man in debt ought to think hard about which side of a dispute he wants to be standing on when the dust settles." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "He threatened you." Didn't sound like a threat. Sounded friendly. That's what scared me worst about it. Curly's hands twisted his hat brim until the felt creased. "I've spent 2 weeks telling myself you were chasing ghosts, ma'am. Telling myself Ward's a good man because a good man doesn't call in a debt when a friend's sister is sick. But a good man also doesn't ride out at midnight to remind a fella which side he ought to pick. I've been lying to myself. I'm done doing it. What are you telling me, Curly?" "I'm telling you I'll say what I know if the boss needs it." To the marshal, to a judge, whoever. His voice shook but didn't break. "Ward come by my place near a year back, complaining about a cook over at the Riordan, spread same way he's complained about you. Called her nosy. Said she wouldn't be a problem much longer. Week later she was gone, and nobody at Riordan's would say where. I didn't think nothing of it then. I think plenty of it now." The kitchen went very still. Thomas had come up behind Margaret without either of them noticing, and his face had gone hard as flint. "Riordan's cook," Thomas said slowly. "That's 2 now. Hattie Vance and a woman from Riordan's both. There's more, I'd wager," Curly said. "Man's been doing this a long while. I was too deep in his pocket to want to see it clear." Margaret reached out, laid a hand briefly on Curly's arm. She said, "This took courage." "Didn't feel like courage," Curly muttered. Felt like finally waking up. He settled his hat back on his head, some of the old stubbornness returning to his jaw, but pointed a different direction now. "You ride to that marshal today, ma'am. You tell him Curly Watts'll swear to what Ward said to me. Debt or no debt. I'm done being scared of a man sheds and cuts fences and calls it neighborly business." They rode out an hour later, Thomas and Margaret together in the wagon, Deke and Sam mounted alongside as escort. Thomas's insistence, not Margaret's, though she hadn't argued hard against it. Not after the fire. Not after the fence. The ride to the county seat took most of the morning, and Margaret spent with the wooden case clutched in her lap, running through everything they'd need to say, every piece of evidence in its proper order. Her mind sharp and focused even as her heart hammered harder the closer they came to town. "You're quiet," Thomas said, glancing at her from the wagon seat. "I'm thinking about Ward, about Hattie Vance, about the woman from Riordan's, about how many more there might be that we haven't found yet." All silence the same careful, quiet way. Margaret's jaw tightened. "I keep thinking about what happens if the marshal doesn't believe us either. If we've come all this way, gathered all this, and it still isn't enough." Thomas was quiet a moment, hands steady on the reins. "Then we make it enough," he said finally. "Don't stop building the case just because one man doubts it. We didn't stop when I doubted you, and thank God for that." Margaret managed a small, tired smile. "Thank God for Deke Sullivan overhearing more than he let on, you mean?" That too. They reached the marshal's office a little past noon, and Margaret felt her pulse spike moments stepped through the door and found the office already occupied not by the marshal alone but by Elias Ward. Seated comfortably in a chair across from the lawman's desk, coffee in hand, looking for all the world like he'd been expecting them. Thomas, Miss Whitmore. Ward rose with unhurried courtesy, tipping his hat. Funny thing, I was just telling Marshal Boone here I had a feeling you two might come calling today. The marshal, a heavyset man named Boone, with a graying mustache and tired eyes that had clearly seen every manner of valley dispute cross his desk, looked between them with the weary patience of a man who wanted this handled quickly and without bloodshed. Mr. Callahan, Boone said, Mr. Ward's been telling me you folks have got some concerns about his business practices. Says it stems from a misunderstanding over kitchen accounts. That's one way to describe stealing from 6 ranches across this valley, Margaret said, setting the wooden case down on the marshal's desk with a firm thud that made both men look at her sharp. I'd call it a different word. Boone's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. I've got serious proof to back it, Margaret said, and opened the case. She laid it out the way she'd practiced in her mind the whole ride into town, the mismatched invoices first, showing the pattern of small, careful overcharges stretched across months. Then the weight discrepancies Deke and Sam had confirmed, deliveries that never matched what was billed. Then the county land records, 6 ranches under contract with Ward Supply, 3 of them selling off parcels of land inside 2 years, every single sale landing with the same buyer, Harrison Cole, whose purchases were financed entirely through an account held by Ward Valley Land Company. Boone's easy skepticism faded with every document she set on his desk, his expression sharpening, his coffee forgotten and cooling beside his elbow. This is Ward's company, Boone said slowly, tapping the bank records Thomas had brought back from Helena. Buying up land from ranches he's been overcharging. That's what the paper trail shows, Thomas confirmed. And there's more, Marshal. Man's been in talks with the Territorial Trust Bank about purchasing the note held against my father's original loan on Callahan Creek. If he buys that note before we can stop it, he can call it due whenever he pleases and take my ranch out from under me, all perfectly legal. Ward, who had gone very still and very quiet during all of this, finally set down his coffee cup with a click that seemed loud in the sudden silence of the office. This is quite a story, he said, and Margaret noted with a small cold satisfaction that some of the easy warmth had drained out of his voice. A cook with a grudge and a rancher desperate to blame anyone but his own poor management, spinning coincidences into a conspiracy. Coincidences don't finance a dozen land purchases through the same holding company, mister. Ward, Margaret said evenly. And coincidences don't send a man out at midnight to remind an indebted ranch hand which side he ought to pick when the truth comes out. Something flickered hard and fast across Ward's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Curly Watts will swear otherwise, Thomas said. Under oath if it comes to that. For the first time since Margaret had met him, Elias Ward's composure cracked just slightly, just enough to see the calculation running fast behind his eyes, a man recognizing the ground shifting under him and scrambling for solid footing. Marshal, Ward said, his voice regaining smoothness even as his eyes stayed hard. Surely you're not going to take the word of a hysterical woman with a grudge and a ranch hand in debt to me over the word of a man who's supplied half this territory honestly for 15 years. I'm not hysterical, Margaret said. I'm right. There's a difference, mister. Ward, and I'd think 15 years of business would have taught you to tell them apart. Boone held up a hand before Ward could respond, his own expression settling into the careful neutrality of a lawman who'd learned long ago not to pick a side before he had to. All right, both of you, quiet a moment. He looked over the document spread across his desk one more time, slower now, more deliberate. This is a lot of paper, and paper doesn't lie, generally speaking. But it's also a serious accusation against a respected businessman, and I'm not about to ride out and arrest a man on the strength of invoices alone. I need more than suspicious numbers, Miss Whitmore. I need proof Ward himself knew these overcharges were happening, proof this wasn't some clerk's error he never caught, but a deliberate scheme he orchestrated. Margaret felt her heart sink even as she kept her face steady. It was exactly what she'd feared, a case strong enough to raise every eyebrow in the room, and still not quite strong enough to force a man like Ward into a cell. Marshal, she started, the pattern across 6 ranches could still be explained away by a dishonest employee Ward himself doesn't know about, Boone said, not unkindly but firmly. I need his own hand in it, ma'am. Something that ties the scheme directly to him, not just to his company. The room went quiet, and Margaret felt the weight of it pressing down all that work, all that risk, and still one piece short of enough. It was Sam who broke the silence, stepping forward from where he'd been waiting quietly by the door, his young face pale but resolute. "Marshal, sir," he said, "I might have something." Everyone turned to look at him, and Sam swallowed hard before continuing. "Few weeks back, I overheard Mr. Ward talking to a writer from the Delacroix spread. Didn't think much of it then. He was talking about an old fool who never checks his own books too close. Talking about margins. About the Delacroix contract specifically." Sam's hands were shaking slightly, but his voice held. "I can swear to that, sir. Under oath, like the boss said about Curly." "That's hearsay," Ward said quickly. "A boy's word about an overheard conversation, months old, easily twisted in the retelling. Might be boon allowed. Might also be worth looking into, alongside everything else." Ward's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Margaret saw something raw flash across his face, not quite panic, but close enough kin to it that her pulse quickened with something dangerously close to hope. Then, just as quickly, Ward's composure smoothed back into place, and he offered Boone a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Marshal, I understand these people believe what they're saying. I truly do. But I'd remind you, and I say this with genuine sympathy, that Miss Whitmore here has a history that might explain her eagerness to see fraud where there's only unfortunate coincidence." Margaret felt her whole body go cold and still. "What history?" Boone asked. Ward turned to look at her directly, and his voice took on a tone of practiced poisonous gentleness. "Her father ran a small store in Ohio some years back. Went bankrupt. Accused his own supplier of cheating him, made quite a public fuss about it, as I understand, and when the dust settled, turns out the man had simply mismanaged his own accounts and needed somewhere else to point the blame. Ruined an innocent man's reputation before the truth came out. Familiar pattern, wouldn't you say?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, and for one terrible suspended moment, she couldn't breathe. It wasn't true. None of it was true. Her father had been right, had been cheated exactly as she remembered, and had died believing it, without ever managing to prove it to a town too eager to believe the respectable merchant over the failing shopkeeper. But Ward had found the shape of her deepest wound and twisted it into a weapon, dressed the truth backward, and was using it now in front of the one man whose belief actually mattered. "That's a lie," she said, and her voice, to her own relief, came out steady, despite the storm raging behind her ribs. "Is it?" Ward's eyebrows lifted mild, reasonable, devastating. "Or is it simply a story you've told yourself so many times you've come to believe your own version of it? I understand, Miss Whitmore. Truly, it must be difficult, carrying a childhood wound like that. But I'd hate to see an innocent man's reputation destroyed because a grown woman never healed from watching her father lose everything and needed someone else to blame for it." The office had gone utterly silent. Margaret could feel every eye on her Boone's, weighing and uncertain now, Thomas's blazing with a fury she hadn't seen from him before, Ward's cold and satisfied beneath the surface performance of sympathy. She thought of her father, standing behind that counter in Ohio, insisting to a town that didn't want to hear it that he'd been cheated, watching his reputation crumble because nobody believed a failing man over a smiling supplier. She thought of every voice that had ever told her, in ways large and small, that her judgment couldn't be trusted, that her pain was really just weakness dressed up as principle. And then she thought of Hattie Vance, alone somewhere out past the edge of this valley, silenced the exact same way. She would not let this be the moment fear finally won. "My father was cheated," Margaret said, her voice rising, clear and unshaking now, cutting through the heavy silence of the office. "I know that because I was the one who found his ledgers after he died, still trying to prove it, still writing letters nobody would answer. I know it the way I know the numbers in that case, Mr. Ward, because I checked them myself over and over, until there was no honest way left to explain them except the truth." She stepped closer to Boone's desk, closer to the evidence laid out across it. "You want to talk about patterns, Marshal? Here's a pattern." A grieving girl watches her father lose everything to a man too respected to be questioned. 15 years later, that same girl finds the exact same scheme happening again, in a different territory, with a different name on the invoices. And instead of admitting what the numbers show, the man behind it tries to convince everyone in the room that she's simply too broken to be believed. Her eyes locked on Ward's, and she watched, with grim satisfaction. Something in his composure finally, truly faltered. "You didn't destroy me once, Mr. Ward. You're not going to manage it twice, wearing a different man's face." The silence that followed rang louder than any shout could have. Boone cleared his throat, glancing between them, something in his weathered face, shifting, not fully convinced, not yet, but no longer sitting comfortably on the fence either. Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "I'm sorry for what happened to your father." Truly. But Mr. Ward's right about one thing, that history, if it's what you say it is, doesn't prove what's happening here. It only explains why you'd be quick to see it. Then don't take my word for it, Margaret said. Don't take Sam's word, or Curly's, or Deke's. Send someone to Ward's warehouse yourself. Look at his own books, his own receipts. Compare them against what he's billed 6 different ranches. The truth won't change depending on who's looking at it, Marshall. That's the whole point of numbers. They don't care whose feelings get hurt when they add up. Boone was quiet a long moment, and Margaret held her breath, watching the scales tip behind his tired eyes. "That's a reasonable request," he said finally. "Ward, you got any objection to me sending a deputy out to look through your warehouse records?" Something flickered across Ward's face, too fast, too controlled to name outright, but Margaret said it, and so, judging by the sudden narrowing of Boone's gaze, did the marshal. "Of course not," Ward said, recovering smooth as ever. "I've got nothing to hide, though I'd think respected businessmen's private records deserve a warrant, Marshal. Not a fishing expedition based on a cook's grudge and a boy's second-hand gossip." "I can get a warrant," Boone said, something harder entering his voice now. "Judge Halloran's in town through Thursday. Won't take more than an hour to get his signature, given what's sitting on my desk right now." Ward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then get your warrant, Marshal." "I'll be at my warehouse, same as every day, with nothing to fear from an honest look at honest books." He rose, tipped his hat with icy courtesy toward Margaret and Thomas both, and walked out of the office without another word, but not before Margaret caught the look he threw her at the door, a look stripped bare of all pretense now, cold and furious, and underneath it something that looked almost like fear. The moment the door swung shut behind him, Boone let out a long breath and looked at the two of them. "That man's hiding something," he said. "Question is whether he's got time to hide it better before I get that warrant signed." The warrant took 2 hours to secure, 2 hours that felt, to Margaret, like the longest stretch of time she'd ever lived through, every minute weighted with the terrible knowledge that somewhere across town, Elias Ward had exactly the same amount of time to burn a ledger, torch a warehouse, disappear a piece of evidence that might otherwise have sealed his fate for good. They waited at the marshal's office, Thomas pacing a groove into the floorboards, Deke and Sam stationed near the window watching the street, Margaret sitting very still with her hands folded tight in her lap, running through every scenario. Every way this could still slip away from them, despite everything they'd gathered. "He's not going to just sit there and let a deputy walk through his books," Thomas said for perhaps the 5th time. "Man's had 2 hours, Margaret. 2 hours to burn whatever needs burning." "Then we'll find something else," Margaret said, though her own certainty had begun to fray at the edges. "There's always something else, Thomas. A man doesn't run a scheme 4 years wide without leaving more than one thread to pull." It was Deke watching the street from the window, who suddenly went rigid. "Rider coming in fast," he said, "coming from the direction of Ward's warehouse." Margaret's heart leapt into her throat as the office door burst open moments later. Not Ward, not a deputy, but a young woman Margaret had never seen before, dust-covered and out of breath, her eyes wild with something between fear and fierce determination. "I need to speak to the marshal," the woman gasped. "Right now before it's too late." Boone rose from his desk, startled. "Ma'am, my name's Louisa Pratt," the woman said, and Margaret's breath caught at the surname Roy's cousin. She realized, the same cousin who'd written the letter about Hattie Vance being run off the Delacroix ranch. I work as a maid over at the boarding house where Elias Ward keeps a room in town. I heard him not 20 minutes ago, shouting at one of his warehouse hands through the wall, telling him to move the second set of ledgers before any deputy comes sniffing around. Telling him to burn what can't be moved fast enough. The office went electric with sudden movement. Boone snatching his hat, calling for his deputy, Thomas already halfway to the door. Second set of ledgers, Boone said grimly. There's your proof if we get there before he finishes burning it. How far to the warehouse? Margaret asked, already moving. 10 minutes riding hard, Deke said. Less if we push it. Then we push it, Thomas said, and the whole party spilled out into the street at a dead run for their horses. Margaret's skirts hiked awkwardly as Deke boosted her up onto the wagon seat, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. They reached Ward Supply's warehouse to a scene of barely controlled chaos, a wagon half loaded with crates being hurriedly hitched, two of Ward's warehouse hands sweating and frantic, and thick gray smoke already curling up from a burn barrel near the loading dock, orange light flickering hungrily at its base. Boone bellowed, drawing his pistol, as he swung down from his horse, deputy right behind him. Territorial law, everybody stand down right now. One of the warehouse hands froze mid-motion, arms full of ledgers he'd been carrying toward the burn barrel. The other bolted for the wagon, but Deke was faster, closing the distance in 3 long strides and hauling the man bodily off the wagon seat before he could crack the reins. Where's Ward? Thomas demanded, striding into the warehouse itself, Margaret close behind him despite Boone's sharp order to stay back. They found him in the back office, a half-burned ledger smoldering in a small stove. More papers scattered across the desk, frantic disorder of a man who'd run out of time to be careful. Ward himself stood frozen, one hand still gripping a fistful of papers he hadn't managed to feed to the flames. For one long suspended moment, nobody moved. Elias Ward, Boone said, his voice gone hard and final, you're under arrest for fraud, and I expect there's going to be a fair few more charges piled on before this day's done. Ward's composure, that careful mask he'd worn through every conversation Margaret had shared with him, finally shattered completely. His face twisted, ugly and desperate, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the courtesy small, frightened, and furious at being caught. You have no idea what you're doing, he snarled. Not at Boone, but at Margaret, his eyes blazing with a hatred that made even steady Thomas take an instinctive step forward, placing himself half between them. 4 years I built this. 4 years of careful work, and you a fat cook nobody wanted. A woman who should have known her place and kept to it. You're going to tear it all down over some kitchen invoices. Over theft, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered against her ribs. Over Hattie Vance and the woman from Reardon's and however many others you silenced along the way. Over a scheme that starved good families off their own land so you could buy it out from under them cheap. That's what I'm tearing down, Mr. Ward, not your reputation. Your crimes did that themselves. I just made sure somebody finally looked. Ward lunged not toward her, but toward the stove, toward the last unburned papers on his desk. Some final desperate attempt to destroy what remained of the evidence, but Boone's deputy was faster, wrestling him back and away before his hands could close around another page. That's enough, Boone said, snapping cuffs around Ward's wrists with the flat, final click of a man who'd stopped listening to excuses. Whatever's left in this office, we're taking every scrap of it into evidence, and you're going to sit in a cell, while a judge sorts out exactly how deep this runs. Ward's shoulders sagged, the fight finally draining out of him, replaced by something smaller and more bitter. This valley will remember me, he muttered, almost to himself. 15 years I built here. This valley's going to remember you for exactly what you were, Thomas said quietly, which is a man who smiled at his neighbors' faces while he robbed them blind. 15 years won't buy you forgiveness for that, Elias. Not from me. Not from anyone. It took the better part of the afternoon to sort through what remained. The half-burned ledger, salvaged before the flames could finish it, showed enough dates, real prices beside falsified ones. A second set of books that told the truth Ward had never intended anyone outside his own circle to see. Combined with Margaret's careful records, the county land documents, Sam's testimony about the overheard conversation, Curly's account of the midnight visit, and Louisa Pratt's frantic warning that had gotten them to the warehouse in time, the case against Elias Ward stood whole and unshakable in a way no amount of smooth talking could argue away. By the time Boone finished cataloging evidence and Ward had been led off to a cell to await the circuit judge, the sun had begun sinking low over the valley, and Margaret found herself standing outside the warehouse in the fading gold light, her whole body trembling now that the danger had finally passed, the fear and fury she'd been holding at bay for weeks finally catching up to her all at once. Thomas found her there, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You did it," he said finally, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like awe. "Margaret, you actually did it." "We did it," she corrected, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "Deke and Sam and Curly and Roy's cousin riding half the county to warn us in time. I couldn't have done any of it alone." "No," Thomas agreed, stepping closer, "but none of them would have known where to look if you hadn't been able to keep asking questions when every voice on this ranch, including mine, told you to stop." He reached out, and this time he didn't pull back the way he had before. His hand found hers, warm and steady despite the tremor still running through her fingers. "I stood in that office and listened to a man try to break you, using the worst thing that ever happened to you, and you didn't bend. Margaret, I have never in my life seen anybody stand that steady against that much weight." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, warm and frightening and entirely unfamiliar, not the numb relief of a fight finally won, but something gentler, more dangerous. The particular vulnerability of being truly seen by someone whose good opinion had somehow, without her quite noticing when, come to matter more than she'd ever meant to let it. "I was terrified," she admitted quietly. "The whole time he was talking about my father, I felt 14 years old again, standing behind that counter, watching everything fall apart and nobody willing to believe us." "I know," Thomas said. "I could see it. And you stood there and fought through it anyway." "That's not the absence of fear, Margaret. That's the finest kind of courage there is." They stood there a long moment, the warehouse behind them, the valley spread gold and quiet in front of them, and something unspoken passed between them that neither one seemed quite ready to name out loud, not yet. Not with the day's danger still humming too fresh in their blood, but there, undeniable, a thread pulled taut between two people who had faced something enormous together and come out the other side changed. "Come on," Thomas said finally, his voice gentler now. "Let's get you home. You've earned some rest, if this valley's going to let you have it." Margaret let him help her up into the wagon, and as they rode back toward Callahan Creek in the deepening evening light, she found herself thinking not of Elias Ward, sitting in his cell awaiting judgment, but of Hattie Vance, wherever she'd ended up, and the woman from Riordan's whose name they still didn't know, and every silenced voice that had never gotten the chance Margaret had just fought so hard to claim. She hadn't just saved Callahan Creek. She'd finally, after all these years, avenged something that had never gotten the justice it deserved. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fading fear, something new had begun taking root, something Margaret Whitmore hadn't let herself want in a very long time. Sitting close beside a man whose hand hadn't once let go of hers the whole ride home. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the little room off the kitchen, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Ward had thrown at her in that warehouse, and somewhere past midnight she gave up trying to rest and lit her lamp instead. Pulling her notebook close and starting, out of pure restless habit, to write down everything that still needed doing. Because a man in a cell wasn't the same as a debt repaid. She knew that better than almost anyone alive. Thomas found her there when he came to check the kitchen fire before dawn, and he stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of her hunched over her notebook with the same exhausted, unstoppable focus she'd worn every night since she'd arrived on this ranch. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you. Couldn't." He came in and sat across from her at the small table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the quiet between them different now than it had been even a week before, easier, though still charged with something neither had named out loud. "I keep thinking about what he said, about Riordan's cook." We don't even know her name, Margaret. We don't know what happened to her. I've been thinking the same thing. Margaret closed her notebook, met his eyes across the lamplight. Ward's in a cell. That doesn't undo what he did to Hattie Vance, or to her, or however many others there might be. It doesn't give them their positions back, their reputations, whatever they lost being called troublemakers for telling the truth. So what do we find them? Margaret said simply. Everyone we can. We make sure the judge hears not just what Ward did to Callahan Creek's ledgers, but what he did to the women who tried to stop him and got thrown out for their trouble. That's not just about winning a case anymore, Thomas. That's about making sure it was worth something, what they went through. Thomas studied her for a long moment, something warm and fierce moving behind his tired eyes. You know, he said, when you first got here, half this ranch thought you were too soft for the work. I don't think there's a harder woman in this territory, Margaret Whitmore. Not in the way that matters. The circuit judge, a stern, silver-haired man named Judge Halloran, arrived in town 4 days later. And word of the case had already spread fast enough through the valley that the courthouse, a modest single-room building that usually saw nothing more dramatic than property disputes and the occasional drunk and disorderly filled. Near to bursting the morning, the proceedings began. Margaret sat in the front row beside Thomas, her wooden case of evidence resting on her lap, watching Elias Ward brought in, wearing shackles, his once immaculate suit rumpled now. His face gray and hollow in a way that made him look years older than the confident man who'd tipped his hat to her outside the Mercantile just weeks before. Boone laid out the case methodically, the invoices, the land records, the burned ledger salvaged from the stove, Sam's testimony about the overheard conversation, Curly's account of the midnight visit and its thinly veiled threat. Margaret watched the judge's face as each piece was presented, watched him lean forward slightly, watched the careful neutrality of a man weighing evidence slowly give way to something harder and more certain. But it was the moment Boone called Louisa Pratt to the stand that the courtroom truly went silent. "Ma'am," Boone said, "tell the court what you told me the day of the arrest." Louisa, still looking nervous in her Sunday dress, folded her hands tight in her lap and spoke clear enough for the whole room to hear. "I've worked at the boarding house going on 3 years. Mr. Ward's kept a room there the whole time. About a year and a half back, I overheard him on the stairs, talking to another man, never got his name, about a woman over at the Hartwell place who'd started asking questions about supply costs, same as Miss Whitmore did here," Mr. Ward said, "and I remember it clear because it chilled me at the time. He said, 'She'll learn to keep her nose where it belongs, or she won't have a place to keep it in much longer.' Week after that, I heard the Hartwell cook had left sudden, no notice, no goodbye to anybody in town." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Halloran had to rap his gavel twice to settle it. Margaret felt Thomas's hand find hers beneath the table, gripping tight, and she gripped back just as hard, her mind racing. Hartwell, another name, another woman's sign, another thread in a pattern stretching wider than even she had feared. "Objection," Ward's lawyer said weakly, a young man clearly out of his depth against the mounting weight of evidence. "This is hearsay, secondhand, unverifiable," Halloran said flatly, not even looking up from his notes. "I've heard enough patterns repeating themselves this morning to stop calling them coincidence, counselor. Sit down." By the time the morning session broke for recess, 3 more names had surfaced from witnesses Margaret hadn't even known existed, a stable hand from the Hartwell ranch who'd heard similar threats, a young clerk from the Territorial Trust Bank who nervously confirmed the details of Ward Valley Land Company's financing arrangement with Harrison Cole, and most devastating of all, a telegram Boone had managed to track down and enter into evidence, sent from a boarding house in Butte 6, signed simply H. Vance, describing in careful, frightened handwriting the exact same scheme Margaret had uncovered: overcharges, threats, a sudden dismissal engineered to look like the cook's own incompetence. "She's alive," Margaret breathed, staring at the telegram as it was read into the record. "Thomas, she's alive. She wrote this. Alive and willing to testify, if the court sends for her." Boone, something in Margaret's chest, some tight, aching knot she hadn't fully realized she was still carrying, finally began to loosen. The trial stretched 3 full days, and each day brought new witnesses, new pieces of a scheme that had grown far larger than even Margaret's most thorough accounting had suggested. Ward's own lawyer, watching his client's careful house of denials collapse under the weight of testimony after testimony, eventually stopped objecting altogether, resigned to whatever verdict was coming. Ward himself said little throughout, sitting stone-faced and shrunken in his chair, though on the second afternoon, during a recess, Margaret found herself briefly alone in the courthouse hallway when he was led past under guard, and he stopped just for a moment, forcing his escort to pause with him. "You think you've won something," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its former warmth, all its practiced charm. "You think this makes you righteous. But you're no different than me, Miss Whitmore. You wanted something. You went and took it, same as I did. Only difference is you dressed yours up in justice." Margaret held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "The difference," she said, "is that I never had to threaten a frightened woman in the middle of the night to get what I wanted. I never burned down another person's livelihood to make them small enough to control. You built everything you had on other people's fear, Mr. Ward. I built what I have on the truth. Those aren't the same thing, no matter how badly you need them to be, sitting in that cell trying to make peace with what you did." Something in Ward's face crumpled, just slightly, before the guard urged him onward, and Margaret stood alone in the hallway a long moment afterward, feeling something settle inside her that felt, for the first time in 15 years, almost like peace. The verdict came on the morning of the 4th day. Judge Halloran didn't take long to deliberate the evidence. By that point, left little room for doubt, and when he read the ruling aloud, his voice carried flat and final through the packed courtroom. Guilty, on every count, fraud, theft, extortion, and after Louisa's testimony and the telegram from Hattie Vance, were weighed together intimidation of witnesses severe enough to warrant the maximum sentence the territorial court could impose. Ward would serve 15 years in the territorial prison. Every parcel of land purchased through Ward Valley Land Company would be returned to its original owners, the sales voided as fraudulent, financed as they were with stolen funds. Every ranch Ward supply had overcharged 6 confirmed, with investigators already following leads toward at least 3 more would receive restitution, calculated from the very ledgers Margaret had spent weeks compiling. The courtroom broke into noise the moment the gavel fell, and Margaret sat frozen for a long moment amid the celebration around her, hardly able to believe the weight finally lifting off her chest after carrying it, in one form or another, for the better part of 15 years. Thomas turned to her, and there were tears standing openly in his eyes now, something he clearly didn't care who saw. "You did this," he said, his voice rough. "Margaret, you did this." "We did," she said again, though this time her own voice broke on the words, 15 years of grief and vindication finally catching up all at once. She had to stop, gather herself. "My father never got this. Nobody ever stood up in a courtroom and said his name, said what happened to him was real. But somebody's finally saying it for the women Ward hurt here. That has to count for something. It has to." Thomas didn't answer with words. He simply pulled her into an embrace, right there in the crowded courtroom, and Margaret let herself lean into it, let herself finally stop holding every piece of herself so carefully upright. And if there were people watching, people who might once have laughed at the size of her or doubted the strength of her, none of it mattered anymore. Not with Thomas Callahan's arms steady around her, and the truth, at long last, out in the open where it belonged. The ride back to Callahan Creek that afternoon felt different than any ride Margaret had taken since arriving in Montana lighter. Somehow, though the exhaustion of the past weeks sat heavy in every muscle of her body. Deke and Sam and Roy met them at the gate, having ridden ahead with news of the verdict, and the whole ranch had gathered in the yard to greet them. A crowd of weathered faces that had once looked at Margaret with doubt and now looked at her with something closer to reverence. 3 cheers for the woman who caught him, Roy shouted, and the yard erupted into noise, hats thrown into the air, someone already breaking out a fiddle from the bunkhouse, and Margaret stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed, laughing despite the tears still standing in her eyes. Curly pushed forward through the crowd, hat in hand, his weathered face solemn. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I owe you an apology bigger than the one I already gave. I doubted you harder than most, defended a man who didn't deserve a lick of my loyalty, and you stood up in that courtroom anyway and made sure the truth won out despite me. That's more grace than I had any right to expect from you." "You told the truth when it counted," Curly, Margaret said. "That's what mattered in the end. Doesn't matter how long it took you to get there." He nodded, throat-working, and stepped back into the crowd, and Margaret felt something warm settle over her at the sight of a man who'd once been Ward's quiet, unwitting shield now standing openly on the side of justice, however hard that turn had cost him. Thomas raised his hands, calling for quiet, and the crowd settled slowly, expectantly. "I want to say something," he said, "in front of a soul on this ranch, because I said something wrong once, in front of most of you, and I aim to correct it just as publicly." He turned to look at Margaret, and something in his voice thickened with emotion he didn't bother hiding. The morning Margaret Whitmore came off that stagecoach, I heard men laughing at her before she'd said a single word. I'll admit to you now, I looked at her myself and made assumptions I'm ashamed of about what a woman her size could handle, about whether she'd last a season in a hard kitchen on a working ranch. I was wrong, dead wrong, and not just about the ledgers, his voice caught. This woman didn't just save my ranch from a man who would have taken it out from under me within the year. She stood in a courtroom and let a stranger tear open the worst wound of her life in front of half this valley, and she didn't break. She looked that man dead in the eye and told the truth anyway. I have never known anybody with courage like that, and I will not let another soul on this ranch forget what she did here, not for as long as I'm alive to remind them. The yard erupted again, and Margaret felt her face flush hot, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of being seen so completely, so publicly, after a lifetime of learning to expect exactly the opposite. In the days that followed, the full scope of what they'd uncovered continued unfolding. Investigators dispatched to Ward's other client ranches confirmed overcharges stretching back nearly 5 years at some of them, and letters began arriving from ranch owners across 3 counties, some grateful, some sheepish at having doubted their own cooks and hands who'd tried to raise the alarm years before and been dismissed. And then 10 days after the verdict, a telegram arrived at Callahan Creek addressed simply to Margaret Whitmore. She opened it with trembling hands in the kitchen, Thomas hovering close, and read the words aloud, her voice catching on every line. Miss Whitmore, heard what you did from a rancher passing through Butte. Wanted to write and tell you I believe every word, because I lived it too. Thought I was alone in it for 2 years. Grateful beyond words to know I wasn't. Would welcome the chance to meet the woman who finally made this valley listen. Hattie Vance. Margaret sat down hard at the kitchen table, the telegram clutched to her chest, and wept not the careful, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in the courtroom, but something deeper. Something that had been waiting 15 years to finally break loose. Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently in his. She's coming? She wants to meet me, Margaret managed. Thomas, she's not alone anymore. Neither of us is. No, Thomas said softly, you're not anymore. Hattie Vance arrived at Callahan Creek 2 weeks later, a slight, sharp-eyed woman a few years older than Margaret, with the wary, watchful bearing of someone who'd learned the hard way not to trust easily. The 2 women stood facing each other in the yard for a long, silent moment before Hattie finally spoke. I read about the trial in a Butte newspaper, she said. Read your name in print, Miss Whitmore, and I sat down right there on the boarding house steps and cried like a fool. 2 years I've been telling myself I imagined the whole thing. Told myself maybe I really was just bad with numbers, like Delacroix said. Maybe I really did deserve to be turned out. You didn't, Margaret said fiercely. None of it was your fault, Hattie. Not one particle. I know that now. Hattie's eyes were wet, but her voice held steady. Took a stranger's courage to remind me of it, is all. Margaret crossed the distance between them and embraced her, and Hattie stiffened for just a moment before sinking into it, both women holding tight to something neither had realized. Until that very instant, they'd been carrying alone for far too long. Over the following days, Hattie stayed on at the ranch, and Margaret watched something remarkable unfold. The two of them comparing notes late into the evenings, piecing together the full timeline of Ward's scheme with a thoroughness that went beyond what either court proceeding had required, simply because both women understood in their bones how much it mattered to have the whole truth written down somewhere permanent, unshakable, impossible to argue away. "You know what I keep thinking about, Hattie," said one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps while the ranch settled into its nightly quiet around them. "All those years, I thought being good with figures, being careful, being the kind of woman who noticed when something didn't add up, I thought that made me difficult. Made me a troublemaker." Delacroix certainly thought so. "I thought the same thing most of my life," Margaret admitted. "Thought if I just kept my head down, didn't ask too many questions, didn't make anybody uncomfortable with what I noticed, maybe I'd be easier to keep around." "And now?" Margaret considered the question a long moment, watching the last light fade gold over the ranch's northern fence line, the fence, rebuilt now, sturdy and whole, that Ward's men had cut in the dead of night not so many weeks before. "Now I think that noticing was never the problem," she said. "The problem was a world that punished women for noticing, instead of thanking them for it." Hattie huffed a small, tired laugh. "Well, this valley's thanking you plenty now, from what I've seen." "This valley's got a long way to go before I trust it fully," Margaret said, though there was warmth in her voice rather than bitterness. "But it's a start. It's more of a start than either of us had before." Not every conversation in those weeks carried such weight. There were lighter moments, 2 evenings when the whole crew gathered for supper, and the talk turned to nothing more serious than the coming autumn roundup, when Deke tried badly to teach Hattie to play a hand of poker and lost 3 straight rounds to a woman who claimed she'd never held a deck of cards in her life. When Sam finally worked up the courage to ask his opinion on a girl he'd been sweet on in town and got mercilessly good-naturedly teased for it around the fire. And through it all, Margaret found herself watching Thomas differently than she had before, not with the wary professional distance she'd maintained those first weeks, but with something softer. Something she'd been too consumed by the fight Ward to properly notice growing between them until now, in the quiet aftermath, it had nowhere left to hide. He found her alone in the kitchen one evening, well after the rest of the ranch had turned in, Margaret going over the restitution figures one more time by lamplight out of habit more than necessity now. "You don't have to keep working these numbers," Thomas said gently, leaning in the doorway. "Case is closed, Margaret. Ward's in prison. The ranch is safe." "Old habit," she admitted, setting down her pen. "Hard to let go of something that's kept me steady this long." Thomas crossed the kitchen and sat across from her, the same way he had that first difficult night weeks ago, though everything about the space between them felt different now. "Can I ask you something always? What happens now? For you, I mean." "Not the ranch. Not the case, you." His voice had gone careful, almost hesitant in a way she hadn't heard from him since those very first uncertain days. "You came here for a cook's position, Margaret, and you've become the reason this whole valley's about to look different. That's not a small thing to walk away from once the excitement settles." Margaret turned the question over, surprised by how much she'd been avoiding asking it of herself. "I don't rightly know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to stay right here, keep running this kitchen, keep things ordinary for a while, after everything." She hesitated. "But another part of me, the part that spent weeks tracking invoices and comparing prices and finally understanding, really understanding, just how much I loved untangling something nobody else could see clearly, that part of me wonders if there isn't something bigger waiting. Something more than cooking, even here, even with people I've come to care for." What kind of something? She hadn't said it aloud to anyone yet, hadn't quite let herself think it fully formed until this very moment, sitting across from him in the lamplight. "A supply business," she said slowly, testing the shape of the words. "Honest. Fair prices, accurate weights, the kind of business that treats every ranch the same whether they're big and prosperous or small and struggling. This valley just watched what happens when nobody's watching close enough. Maybe it needs somebody who's made a career out of noticing." Thomas was quiet a long moment, and Margaret watched something complicated move across his face, pride unmistakably, but underneath it something that looked almost like fear, quickly hidden. "That's a fine idea," he said finally. "You'd be good at it." "Better than good. You don't sound thrilled by it." He let out a breath, dragged a hand through his hair. "I am thrilled by it, Margaret, for you." It's just stopped himself, started again. "A business like that, done right, it'd mean traveling this whole valley regular. Might mean you're not standing in this kitchen every evening the way you have been. And I find I've gotten used to you being here. More used to it than I probably ought to admit out loud." Margaret felt her breath catch, something warm and unsteady blooming in her chest. "Thomas, I know it's not my place to ask you to stay small for my sake," he said quickly, like he was afraid of losing his nerve if he didn't get the words out fast. "You've spent your whole life being told to make yourself smaller, quieter, less than what you actually are, and I will be damned if I become one more voice telling you to shrink your ambitions down to fit comfortably around my kitchen table. Whatever you decide, Margaret, whatever this business becomes, I want you to know I'll be standing behind it, not standing in the way of it." Something in Margaret's chest cracked wide open at that, 15 years of careful self-protection finally giving way entirely. "I don't want you standing behind it," she said softly. "I want you standing beside it, beside me, if that's something you're offering." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow, careful circles against her knuckles. "It's exactly what I'm offering," he said. "Has been for a while now, if I'm honest. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was trying to hold you back." "You're not holding me back," Margaret said, her voice thick. "You're the first person in a long, long time who's made me feel like there's nothing wrong with taking up as much space as I need to." The following weeks brought a steady stream of visitors to Callahan Creek ranch owners from across the valley. Some come to formally apologize for doubting their own cooks and hands over the years. Others simply curious to meet the woman whose stubborn arithmetic had brought down a scheme that had quietly bled the whole territory dry. Delacroix himself made the awkward journey out, hat in hand, to offer Hattie Vance a formal public apology and the back wages he owed her for the years she'd been unfairly dismissed an apology. Hattie accepted with more grace than Margaret suspected she herself would have managed had their positions been reversed. The restitution money, when it finally began arriving from the territorial court, transformed Callahan Creek almost overnight. The debt Thomas had been quietly drowning under for 3 years shrank to something manageable, then within a season to nothing at all. The supply shed was rebuilt sturdier than before. New cattle replaced what had been lost to the cut fence. And slowly, steadily, the whole ranch began to breathe easier. The constant low hum of financial dread that had shadowed every decision Thomas made, finally blessedly quieting. "You know," Thomas said one evening, standing beside Margaret at the newly mended northern fence line, watching the cattle graze peaceful and unbothered in the fading light, "my father built this place out of nothing but stubbornness and bad luck he refused to let win. I think he'd have liked you. I think I'd have liked to meet him," Margaret said. "Sounds like he'd have understood exactly why I couldn't let this go once I started pulling the thread." He would have. Thomas was quiet a moment, watching the herd. "I used to think keeping this ranch alive meant keeping everything exactly the way he left it. Every decision, every method, like changing anything meant betraying his memory somehow." He glanced at her, something soft and certain in his expression now. "You taught me different, taught me the ranch doesn't survive by staying the same. It survives by growing into whatever it needs to be next." Margaret felt the weight of those words settle warm in her chest. "Is that your way of telling me you're not scared of what comes next?" "I'm terrified of what comes next," Thomas admitted, honest laugh escaping him. "Terrified in the good way, though. The kind of scared that means something worth having is standing right in front of you." It was Deke, of all people, who finally said out loud what half the ranch had been quietly noticing for weeks. "You two gonna keep dancing around it?" he said one evening at supper, not unkindly, grinning around a mouthful of biscuit. "Or are you gonna admit what every hand on this ranch already knows plain as day?" Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. Margaret felt her face go hot straight up to her hairline. "Deke Sullivan," she started, but Roy cut, laughing outright now. "He's not wrong, ma'am. Boss hasn't stopped finding excuses to be wherever you are since the trial ended. Man used to eat supper in 10 minutes flat, out working before the rest of us finished our coffee. Lately he's lingering at that table like the sun rises and sets by your company." "That's enough out of both of you," Thomas said, though there wasn't much heat behind it, and Margaret noticed, with a private warm little thrill, that he didn't actually deny a word of it. Later that night, once the teasing had died down and the kitchen had emptied out, Thomas found her again in the quiet, the lamp burning low between them same as it had on so many evenings now. "They're not wrong, you know," he said. "Deke and Roy. I noticed you didn't argue with them very hard. Didn't see much point in arguing with the truth." He reached for her hand again, that same slow, careful gesture that had become familiar between them these past weeks. "Margaret, I know you've got a business to build, a life you're only just now letting yourself imagine having. I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm asking if there's room in whatever you're building for a rancher who's not going anywhere, whenever you're ready to make room for him." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes again, softer ones this time, nothing like the grief and vindication of the courtroom, something closer to pure unguarded joy. "There's room," she said quietly. "There's been room for a while now, Thomas. I was just scared to say it out loud, same as you." He drew her hand up, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, and Margaret felt something settle inside her, deep and certain, unlike anything she'd let herself feel in 15 careful years of keeping her guard up against exactly this kind of hope. "Then I suppose," Thomas said softly, "we've got a great deal to figure out." Together. Outside, the ranch settled into its evening quiet, cattle lowing soft in the distance, the mended fence line, and staying sturdy against the coming dark, and Margaret Whitmore, the woman half this valley had once laughed at, doubted, tried to silence, sat in a warm kitchen with her hand held steady in the grip of a man who had learned the hard way exactly what she was worth. Autumn came to the valley slower than usual that year, the cottonwoods along the creek holding their gold a few extra weeks, as if even the land itself understood there was something worth taking its time over. Margaret stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching frost silver the fence posts, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, that she had never in her life felt this steady standing still. "You're smiling at nothing again," Hattie said, coming in with an armful of firewood, setting it down by the stove with the easy familiarity of a woman who'd made this kitchen half her own these past weeks. "Man hasn't even walked through the door yet. I can smile at nothing if I please," Margaret said, though her cheeks warmed all the same. "Suit yourself." Hattie grinned, brushing bark dust from her sleeves. "Just don't let the biscuits burn while you're mooning over Thomas Callahan. Man'll survive a few extra minutes without your company. Biscuits won't survive the oven if you're not watching them." Margaret laughed and turned back to her work, but the warmth in her chest didn't fade, not even when the morning's business pulled her attention elsewhere, because there was business now, real business, spread across the kitchen table in careful stacks that had nothing to do with ranch suppers at all. Whitmore Provisions had been 3 months in the making, built slow and deliberate the way Margaret built everything worth keeping. She'd started small, just her and Hattie and a modest line of credit from the Territorial Trust Bank. A bank considerably more willing to extend her trust now than it might have been before her name had appeared in every newspaper from Bozeman to Helena. They'd secured a warehouse in town, not Ward's old building, which sat empty and shuttered, a monument to everything greed eventually cost a man, but a smaller space 2 streets over, freshly whitewashed, with a hand-painted sign out front that still made Margaret's chest tighten with pride every time she rode past it. "Deliveries confirmed for Hartwell," Hattie said, scanning the morning's correspondence. And the Riordan place wrote back finally. "Took them long enough." "They've got reason to be cautious," Margaret said. "Every rancher in this valley got burned trusting the wrong supplier once already. I'd rather earn their business slow and honest than rush it and give them cause to doubt me. Even after everything you did for this whole territory." "Especially after," Margaret said. "Trust isn't a debt people owe you for doing right, Hattie." It's something you keep earning, same as anybody else. I learned that the hard way, and I don't intend to forget it just because folks are calling me a hero these days. Hattie shook her head, something fond and exasperated in her expression. You're going to work yourself into an early grave being humble about all this. Maybe, Margaret allowed, but at least it'll be an honest grave. Thomas found them there an hour later, stamping snow-dusted boots at the kitchen door. And Margaret felt the same small flip in her chest she'd felt every single time he walked through a door these past months, a feeling she'd stopped trying to talk herself out of, because some things, she'd decided, weren't meant to be argued away. Riders coming up the road, he said, whole party of them. Looks official. Margaret's pulse quickened, though not with fear this time. She'd had enough practice these past months to recognize the difference. Territorial officials? Judge Halloran's clerk from the look of the wagon. And somebody else I don't recognize. They walked out to the yard together, the whole ranch crew gathering loosely behind them, the way they tended to now whenever anything of note happened at Callahan Creek, and Margaret watched the wagon roll to a stop. Watched a well-dressed man she didn't recognize climb down and remove his hat with careful formality. Miss Whitmore, he said, name's Adler. I represent the Territorial Governor's office out of Helena. Margaret felt Thomas's hand find the small of her back, steady and grounding. What can I do for the governor's office, Mr. Adler? It's more what you've already done, ma'am. Adler produced a sealed envelope from his coat, extending it toward her with a formality that made Margaret's hands tremble slightly as she accepted it. Word of the Ward case reached Helena weeks back. Governor's office has been reviewing it closely, given the scope of the fraud and how many ranches across 3 counties were affected. There's talk, ma'am, of establishing new oversight for supply contracts, territory-wide inspections, standardized weights, a registry ranchers can check before signing with any merchant. The governor would like your input on how such a system might work, given you're the one who uncovered the whole scheme in the first place. Margaret stood frozen a moment, the envelope heavy in her hands, hardly able to process the shape of what was being offered to her. Me, she said. You want my input. Governor specifically asked for you, ma'am. Said if anybody in this territory understood how a scheme like Ward's operates from the ground up, it'd be the woman who caught it with nothing but a notebook and good arithmetic. Behind her, Margaret heard Deke let out a low whistle, and Roy's voice, unable to help himself, told you she was something else, didn't I say it? Margaret opened the envelope with careful fingers, scanning the formal invitation inside a request for her presence in Helena the following month, to consult on territorial supply regulations. Her name printed alongside titles and credentials she'd never once imagined attaching to herself. Thomas, she breathed, turning to him. They want to change the law. Because of what happened here. Thomas's face had gone soft with something between pride and wonder, and he reached out to squeeze her shoulder, steady and warm. Course they do, he said. You didn't just catch one thief, Margaret. You showed a whole territory exactly how easy it is for good people to be cheated when nobody's watching close enough. Only makes sense they'd want the woman who finally watched close enough helping fix it for good. Margaret traveled to Helena 3 weeks later, Hattie insisting on accompanying her, both women settling into a modest boarding house near the territorial capital with a mixture of nerves and fierce, quiet pride that neither bothered hiding from the other. The meeting itself unfolded in a manner Margaret hadn't quite expected, not the intimidating formality she'd braced herself for, but a room full of serious, attentive men, and to her surprise, 2 other women, both ranch owners in their own right, all of them leaning forward as she laid out, point by careful point, exactly how Elias Ward's scheme had operated, exactly what warning signs a proper inspection system might have caught years earlier. Exactly what safeguards could prevent the next Ward from ever getting far enough to threaten a rancher's land at all. The trouble, Margaret said, standing at the front of the room with her notes spread before her, wasn't just that Ward cheated people. It's that he cheated them slow, careful, small enough each time that no single overcharge looked worth questioning. A registry helps, but it's not enough on its own. You need regular, unannounced comparisons between what's billed and what's actually delivered, real weights, prices, checked against market rates, not just paperwork a clever man can falsify at his leisure. And you need somewhere safe for the people who notice something wrong to report it, without fear of losing their position over speaking up. Ward silenced at least 3 women I know of before I ever set foot in this territory. A system that doesn't protect the people brave enough to notice fraud is a system that'll let the next ward operate for years before anybody stops him. The room fell quiet, and one of the territorial officials, an older man with steel-gray hair and a skeptical set to his jaw, finally spoke. "That's a fair point, Miss Whitmore, but forgive me, you're proposing quite a lot of oversight for merchants who've done nothing wrong. Seems like it might make honest business harder to conduct." Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "With respect, sir, honest business has nothing to fear from being checked. Only dishonest business does. I ran an honest kitchen at Callahan Creek, and I welcomed every bit of scrutiny anybody wanted to throw at my books, because I had nothing in them to hide. The merchants who'll complain loudest about oversight, in my experience, are usually the ones with the most reason to avoid it." A murmur of agreement moved through the room, and even the skeptical official allowed a small grudging nod. By the time the meeting concluded, Margaret had been asked to help draft the formal language for what officials were already calling, somewhat unofficially, the Whitmore Standard, a set of supply oversight regulations that would, within the year, spread not just across the territory, but into neighboring counties as word of its effectiveness traveled. She walked out of that building into the cold Helena afternoon with Hattie at her side, both women silent for a long moment, overwhelmed. 15 years ago, Margaret finally said, her voice thick, "Nobody in Ohio would even let my father finish a sentence about what happened to his store. Today I just told a room full of territorial officials how to stop the next man from doing what was done to him, and they listened." Every word. Hattie squeezed her arm. "Your father would be so proud of you, Margaret." "I never knew the man, but I know that much for certain." Margaret looked up at the gray Montana sky, feeling something settle deep and permanent inside her chest, not just vindication anymore, not just relief, but purpose, whole and solid and entirely her own. "I think," she said quietly, "I finally believe that too." She returned to Callahan Creek a week later to find the ranch transformed in her absence, not physically, though the new supply shed stood sturdy and finished now, but in the particular quality of ease that had settled over the place. The same men who'd once laughed at her arrival now greeting her homecoming with genuine warmth, Curly foremost among them, waiting at the gate with his hat already off. "Ma'am," he said, "heard you told the whole territorial government how to run their business." "That true." "Something like that," Margaret said, smiling despite her exhaustion from the journey. "Well," Curly shifted, something almost shy in his weathered face. "Wanted you to know I wrote a letter myself while you were gone. To that governor's office. Told them exactly what I told the marshal about Ward's midnight visit, about the threat dressed up as friendly advice. Figured if they're building some kind of registry to protect folks like me from getting squeezed the way I got squeezed, they ought to hear it from more than just you." Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest, that not surprise exactly, because she'd watched Curly's slow transformation these past months with quiet hope, but a kind of deep settled gratitude at seeing it fully realized. "Thank you, Curly," she said. "That took courage." "Learned it from watching you, ma'am," he said simply, and settled his hat back on his head, and Margaret thought, watching him walk away, that this took quiet, hard-won redemption in a man who'd once defended her worst enemy out of fear mattered every bit as much as the courtroom victory that had started it all. Thomas met her at the main house, and the moment she saw his face, she knew something had happened while she'd been away, something good, judging by the barely contained energy in the way he crossed the yard toward her. "What is it?" she asked, laughing despite herself. "You look like a man who's swallowed a secret whole." "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. "There's something I want to show you before you even get your bags unpacked." He led her past the main house, past the rebuilt supply shed, out toward the northern pasture where the fence had once been cut, where cattle now grazed peaceful and plentiful under the pale autumn sky. And there, on a rise overlooking the whole sweep of Callahan Creek land, stood a small building Margaret hadn't seen before, freshly framed, not yet finished, but unmistakably new. "Thomas," she said slowly. "What is this?" "Office," he said, a little nervous now, rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when something mattered enough to make him unsteady. "For Whitmore Provisions. Figured you'd need somewhere out here, close to the ranch, for the days you're not in town at the warehouse. Somewhere that's yours." He paused. "I had the men start on it the week you left for Helena." Wanted it to be a surprise. Margaret stood staring at the half-finished frame, feeling something rise in her throat too large for easy words. "You built me an office." "I built you a place that says you belong here," Thomas corrected gently. "Not as somebody's cook, not as somebody's guest passing through. As somebody whose business, whose future, whose whole life is welcome to grow right alongside this ranch's. Whatever shape that takes." He turned to face her fully now, something raw and open in his expression that she'd rarely seen from him, even in their most honest moments. "Margaret, I've been thinking on this a long while, and I don't want to say it wrong, so I'm just going to say it plain. I don't want you building a life next to mine. I want you building it with me. All the way through, however many years we've got left to build it in." Margaret felt her breath catch entirely, her heart hammering so loud she was certain he could hear it. "Thomas Callahan," she managed, "are you asking me to marry you standing in the middle of a half-built office?" "Reckon I am," he said, and there was a of nervous laughter in his voice now, the confident rancher who'd once accused her across a slammed ledger reduced in this moment to something achingly vulnerable. "Wasn't exactly how I planned it. Figured I'd wait for something more polished, more romantic. But I've spent 3 months watching you build something extraordinary out of nothing but grit and good arithmetic, Margaret, and I want to wait one more day pretending I don't know exactly what I want. I want you. All of you, the fierce parts, the careful parts, the parts of you that notice everything and refuse to back down even when the whole world's laughing. I love every bit of who you are, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you'd let me spend the rest of mine standing beside you." Margaret felt tears spill freely down her face now, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Didn't bother composing herself the careful way she'd trained herself to do her whole life, in front of people who might use her emotion against her, because this man, standing before her with his heart laid bare and unguarded, had never once been that kind of danger to her.
"Yes," she said,
The word coming out on a breath, on a laugh, on years of careful walls finally, joyfully collapsing. "Thomas, 1,000 times yes." He crossed the last few feet between them and kissed her, right there on the rise overlooking Callahan Creek, the autumn wind catching at her skirts, the half-built office standing witness to a promise neither of them intended to break. And Margaret Whitmore, the woman half this valley had once dismissed with a single glance, the woman who'd carried her father's unfinished grief for 15 long years. The woman who'd stood in a courtroom and refused to let her deepest wound be turned into a weapon against her felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely whole. They married in the spring, in a ceremony that filled Callahan Creek's yard with more people than the chambered at once, every from the ranch, of course. Deke standing up as Thomas's best man with unabashed tears in his eyes throughout the whole ceremony, Roy and Sam grinning like fools in the front row. Curly stood near the back, quiet and proud. Hattie Vance served as Margaret's attendant, radiant in a way Margaret hadn't seen from her since she'd first arrived at the ranch, still carrying the weight of Delacroix's betrayal. And scattered through the crowd, faces from every corner of the scandal that had brought them all together, Louisa Pratt, who'd ridden hard to warn them in time and had since become something of a permanent fixture at Whitmore Provisions' town office. Ranch owners from 6 different spreads Ward had once cheated. Come to celebrate the woman who'd finally set their accounts and their trust back to right, even Judge Halloran himself, retired now from the circuit but insistent on attending the wedding of the woman whose testimony he still called, privately, the most compelling he'd heard in 30 years on the bench. Margaret stood at the makeshift altar built beneath the same northern fence line, where cattle had once scattered through Ward's cut wire, where a supply shed had once burned in the dark, trying to frighten her into silence, and felt the full weight of everything that land had witnessed, fear, doubt, cruelty, and now finally this. Joy hard won and entirely deserved. "You look like you're thinking too hard for a bride," Thomas murmured, leaning close as the minister prepared to begin. I'm thinking, Margaret said softly, about how much this land has seen. Fire theft, a courtroom fight that nearly broke me open. And now this. She looked up at him, tears already threatening despite her best efforts to hold them back. I'm thinking that everything terrible that happened here, it didn't ruin this place. It built something stronger instead, same as it built us. Same as it built you, Thomas corrected gently. I was already halfway there before I even knew your name, Margaret. You're the one who had to fight to become who you already were. Underneath all that doubt, this valley kept piling onto you. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of warmth and quiet vows, and when Thomas finally kissed her as her husband, the whole yard erupted into cheering loud enough, Deke would later joke, to be heard clear in Helena. Whitmore Provisions grew steadily through that first married year, expanding its reach across 3 counties, its reputation for honest weights and fair prices spreading faster than Margaret had ever dared hope. She hired on 2 more clerks to help manage the growing correspondence, brought Hattie on as a full partner rather than simply an employee, and watched with quiet, fierce pride as ranch after ranch across the valley, many of them the very same spreads, Ward had once quietly bled dry-signed contracts built on the kind of transparency her old tormentor had spent 4 careful years hiding from. The Whitmore Standard, meanwhile, spread beyond Montana's borders within 18 months, adopted first by neighboring territories, eager to prevent their own version of the Ward scandal. Then eventually, cited in supply regulation debates as far east as the territorial capitals of Wyoming and Idaho. Margaret found herself, more than once, receiving letters from women in other territories, cooks, clerks, shopkeepers' daughters who'd read about her case in a newspaper and finally found the courage to speak up about discrepancies they'd long noticed and long been too frightened to report. She answered every single one of those letters personally, no matter how full her days grew, because she understood, better than most anyone alive, exactly how much it mattered to a frightened woman staring down a powerful man's denial to hear, from someone who'd survived it, that she wasn't imagining things, that she wasn't hysterical or difficult or troublesome, that the numbers she saw were real, and so was she. 2 years after the trial that had changed everything, Margaret stood once more at the kitchen window of the main house, her house now, in every sense that mattered, watching autumn settle gold over Callahan Creek's northern pasture, one hand resting absently over the gentle curve of her belly, the first quiet stirrings of a child Thomas hadn't quite finished believing was real yet. Hattie found her there, same as she often did, though these days she visited from her own small house in town rather than living full-time on the ranch, her partnership with Margaret thriving alongside a modest romance of her own, with a widowed rancher 2 spreads over, who'd taken one look at her sharp mind and steady courage and never looked back. You're doing it again, Hattie said, smiling at nothing. Not nothing this time, Margaret said, resting her hand more fully against her stomach. Everything, maybe. Feels like everything some days. Hattie crossed to stand beside her at the window, both women quiet a moment, watching the ranch spread golden and peaceful before them. Do you ever think about it? Hattie asked. How different this all could have gone, if you'd just kept your head down that first week. If you'd decided the risk wasn't worth it, let Ward keep cheating this valley however long he pleased. Margaret considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. I think about it, she admitted. Mostly I think about how many times in my life I almost did exactly that. Kept my head down, stayed quiet to stay safe. My whole life, this world taught me that a woman my size, a woman with too many opinions and too sharp an eye of our numbers, was safer small and silent. She looked at Hattie, something fierce and grateful in her expression. I think about how close I came to believing that lesson permanently. And I think about you and Louisa and Curly and every single person who found their own courage because I finally refused to believe it anymore. That's what I think about mostly, not what could have gone wrong. What very nearly stayed wrong if any one of us had stayed quiet. Hattie squeezed her hand, and outside the sound of Thomas's voice carried faint across the yard, calling something good-natured to Deke about the coming roundup. His laughter warm and easy in a way it had rarely been those first anxious months Margaret had known him. "He still doesn't quite believe his own luck, Hattie said, watching him through the window. "Told me himself just last week. Said he still half expects to wake up and find out the whole thing was a dream, the marriage, the baby coming, all of it." "He's not the only one," Margaret said softly. "Some mornings I still expect to open my eyes and find myself back on that stagecoach, listening to men laugh at the size of me before I've said a single word. Took me a long while to trust that all of this was really mine to keep." And now? Margaret looked out at the ranch, at the mended fences and the rebuilt shed and the small office building on the rise where her business had grown from nothing into something that reached clear across 3 territories, at the man crossing the yard toward the house, with a smile already forming the moment he caught sight of her through the window, and felt something settle inside her, deep and unshakable and entirely certain. "Now I know it," Margaret said. "Every bit of it. Nobody's ever taking that from me again." Thomas came through the kitchen door a few minutes later, stamping the dust from his boots, and crossed straight to her without hesitation, the way he always did now. Pressing a kiss to her temple and resting his broad hand gently over hers, where it still lay against the curve of her belly. "Roundup crew wants to know if you're cooking supper tonight," he said, "or if the famous Margaret Whitmore's got more important business to attend to." "Tell them I'm cooking," Margaret said, laughing. "Some things a person doesn't give up, no matter how far the business grows. I built my whole life on this kitchen once, Thomas. Seems fitting I'd still stand in it, even now." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Thomas said, and meant it, the way he meant everything he said to her these days, plain, unguarded, without a single trace of the doubt that had once stood so stubbornly between them. Margaret turned back to her stove, Hattie already reaching for an apron beside her out of old habit, the warm, familiar rhythm of a kitchen full of people who loved her settling comfortably around them both, and felt, in that ordinary, golden moment, the full and complete shape of everything she had fought so hard to claim. She had arrived at Callahan Creek a stranger nobody wanted, judged before she'd said a single word, doubted by the very man who would one day call her wife. She had uncovered a scheme that had quietly starved an entire valley of its trust and its land, had stood in a courtroom and let her deepest wound be weaponized against her, and had refused every single time to let anyone convince her that her voice, her judgment, her worth was anything less than exactly what it had always been. She had not needed saving. She had needed simply believed, and in fighting to be believed, she had saved an entire valley in return, one honest ledger at a time. Margaret Whitmore had come to Montana looking for nothing more than a cook's position and a fresh start. She left an entire territory forever changed, a criminal behind bars, a business built on nothing but honesty and grit, a husband who loved every fierce, unyielding, unapologetic part of her, and a child on the way who would grow up in a valley that had finally truly learned never to judge a person by what the eye saw first. The woman everyone once underestimated had become the very foundation this land now stood on, and nothing, not doubt, not cruelty, not 15 years of buried grief, would ever be strong enough to shake that foundation again.